Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something colder than your mother-in-law's stare at Thanksgiving. Christmas in total darkness. Not, oops, the power went out darkness. Not romantic candlelit dinner darkness. I mean pitch black, sun hasn't risen in 6 weeks. Arctic Circle darkness where noon looks like midnight, and you start questioning whether the sun was ever real to begin with. We're talking about how people in Norway, Finland and Iceland celebrated Christmas when the world around them was locked in 24-hour night. So before you drift off, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'm guessing it's probably dark there too, but at least your sun will come back tomorrow. Now, dim those lights. Or don't. You're already living in the vibe. Switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pull that blanket a little tighter, because we're going somewhere cold. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what Christmas feels like when there's no daylight? How do you know when to wake up? When do you eat breakfast if morning never comes? Did people just live by candlelight and vibes? How did they celebrate when stepping outside meant risking frostbite and possibly meeting a troll? Would you last a week without seeing the sun? Or would you start talking to your furniture by day 3? And most importantly, how do you roast chestnuts by an open fire when you're burning the fire just to not die? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in a small wooden cabin in northern Norway. The year is 1823, it's December 21st. You check outside, it's 2 p.m. It's also completely black. The sun left 6 weeks ago, and honestly, you're starting to forget what it looks like. Welcome to Christmas in the dark. You open your eyes, it's dark. You wait a few minutes. Still dark. You check the window. Also dark. Congratulations, you've just experienced what scientists call polar night, and what you'd probably call a very good reason to never live here. For the next month, the sun will not rise. Not even a little. Not even to check in. Your body is confused. Deeply confused. Every cell in your DNA is screaming that it's the middle of the night and you should go back to sleep, but your neighbour is already up. You can hear him coughing through the wall, so apparently it's morning, or afternoon, or breakfast time. Honestly, nobody really knows anymore. You lie there for a moment, staring at the ceiling you can't see, wondering if this is what it feels like to live inside a sensory deprivation tank, except colder. And you share it with a family of 7 and possibly a goat. Eventually you give up on waiting for a sunrise that will never come and fumble around in the dark for a candle. Your fingers are already numb. Even though you're indoors, the cabin is freezing. The fire from last night has died down to embers, and now you have to decide. Do you get up and restart it, or do you burrow deeper into your pile of furs and pretend today isn't happening? You choose the fire, reluctantly. You swing your legs out of bed and immediately regret being born. The floor is ice, not cold, ice. You're wearing wool socks that you knitted yourself last winter. And they do absolutely nothing. It's like walking barefoot on a hockey rink in medieval times. Which, let's be honest, is exactly where you are mentally. You strike a flint and light a candle. The tiny flame flickers to life, and suddenly you can see about 3 feet in front of you. That's it. The rest of the cabin is still swallowed in darkness. Your children are lumps under blankets. Your spouse is a vague shape snoring in the corner. The goat, because yes, you brought the goat inside so it wouldn't freeze, is staring at you with glowing eyes like some kind of barnyard demon. You shuffle over to the fireplace and start rebuilding the fire with stiff, clumsy fingers. The wood is cold, the kindling is damp. Everything takes twice as long as it should because you're doing it by candlelight, and also because you've forgotten what warmth feels like. It's 9 a.m. Technically, you think. Outside, the world is a void. If you cracked the door open and looked out, you'd see nothing, just black. Maybe some snow-reflecting starlight if you're lucky. Maybe the vague outline of the neighbour's cabin. Maybe a troll. Who knows? You're not opening that door. This is your reality now. You'll wake up in the dark. You'll eat breakfast in the dark. You'll do chores in the dark. You'll go to bed in the dark. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again. The only thing keeping you sane is the knowledge that in about 6 weeks the sun will return. Probably. You think it will. People keep saying it will. But right now, staring into the black abyss outside your window, It's hard to believe the sun was ever real in the first place. It's like living in a permanent 4 a.m, except 4 a.m. lasts all day, and also it's December, and also you might run out of food. Welcome to the polar night. It's going to be a long winter, so here's the thing. How do you know when it's morning if morning never gets bright? Spoiler, you don't. People relied on clocks, roosters that had long given up, and a vague internal sense of, I think I slept enough. Time became a suggestion. Meals happened when someone decided they happened. Midnight and noon were functionally identical. If you were wealthy, and let's be clear, most people weren't, you might own a clock, a real ticking clock that someone imported from Germany or England at great expense. You'd wind it religiously, check it constantly and treat it like the only tether to reality you had left. Because without it, time just dissolved. But most families didn't have clocks. They had roosters. Except roosters, it turns out, are not great at their jobs when the sun never rises. Your rooster would crow at what it thought was dawn. Then it would crow again 2 hours later, then maybe at midnight, just to keep everyone guessing. Eventually the rooster would give up entirely and just crow whenever it felt like causing chaos. You'd learn to ignore it. So instead you relied on routine. You woke up when you woke up. You ate breakfast when someone lit the fire and boiled the porridge. Lunch happened when your stomach said it was time. Dinner occurred when the family gathered and someone said, I think it's dinner now. It was like living in a perpetual Sunday where you've napped 3 times and no longer know what day it is. Except it's December. And it's freezing. And this will continue for 2 more months. Church bells helped, if you lived near a church. The bells would ring for morning prayers, midday prayers, evening prayers. They gave the day structure. They reminded you that time was still passing, even if it didn't feel like it. But if you lived out in the countryside, miles from the nearest village, you were on your own. You and your confused rooster, figuring it out together. Children had no concept of bedtime. How could they? Bedtime is when it gets dark outside, but it's always dark outside, so children would stay up until they physically collapsed from exhaustion, and parents would just let it happen. What else could you do? Ground them? Go to your room, it's night time. It's always night time, mother. Work schedules were similarly vague. Fishermen and hunters would head out in the morning, which meant whenever they woke up and decided they had enough energy to not die. Farmers had it easier. There was no farm work in December anyway. The ground was frozen solid. The animals were huddled indoors. You just existed. It's a bit like working from home during a pandemic and realising you've eaten lunch at 10 a.m. and dinner at 3 p.m. and you're not sure if you showered yesterday or 3 days ago. Except you're in 1823 and there's no Netflix to anchor your sense of time. Just a candle burning down and the faint hope that tomorrow will feel different than today. It won't. Time in the polar night wasn't measured in hours. It was measured in candles burned, meals eaten, and stories told. You'd say things like, I'll meet you at the neighbour's house after 2 candles, which meant absolutely nothing and everything at the same time. The worst part? You'd start to lose track of what day it was. Was it Thursday? Saturday? Had Christmas already passed, or was it still coming? Someone would have to check a carved wooden calendar, little notches marked into a stick to count down the days until the sun returned. People adapted, obviously. Humans always do. But adaptation doesn't mean it wasn't deeply, profoundly disorienting. Time became liquid. Days blurred together. And you just had to trust that eventually, somewhere beyond the endless black, the sun was still out there, keeping its own schedule, and it would come back when it was ready. Spoiler, it did. But that didn't make the waiting any less maddening. In Arctic villages, candles weren't decor. They were survival. They were currency. They were your alarm clock, your nightlight, your entire social calendar. Families hoarded tallow and beeswax like Costco members hoarding toilet paper in 2020. Running out of candles in December was like running out of Wi-Fi during a Zoom call. Technically survivable, but deeply upsetting. Let's put this in perspective. A single candle might burn for 3 to 4 hours, maybe 5 if you were lucky and it was good quality. Now consider that you need light for approximately 16 to 18 hours a day, because the sun has completely abandoned you. That's 4 to 6 candles per day for a household. Do the math. Over a 2-month polar night, you're looking at somewhere between 240 to 360 candles per family. That's not a stockpile, that's a warehouse. So starting in summer, back when the sun was still cooperating, families began preparing. Women rendered animal fat into tallow, a process that smelled exactly as appetizing as it sounds. They'd take sheep fat, beef fat, whatever they could get, and boil it down into a waxy substance that could be moulded around a wick. It smelled like a barbecue gone wrong. It smoked, it sputtered, but it burned, and that's all that mattered. If you were wealthier, you used beeswax. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, smelled better, and lasted longer. They were the luxury SUV of the candle world. Churches used beeswax. Rich merchants used beeswax. You? You used tallow and pretended it was fine. Candle making became a multi-generational operation. Grandmothers supervised. Mothers dipped. Children held the wicks. Everyone had a role because everyone understood what was at stake. Running out of candles in January wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. You couldn't cook. You couldn't see. You couldn't do anything except sit in the dark and contemplate your poor planning skills. And here's the thing. Candles weren't just for light. They were social currency. If you visited a neighbour and brought candles as a gift, you were a hero. If you borrowed a candle and forgot to pay it back, you were on the village blacklist. People kept mental ledgers. "Oh, Bjorn still owes me 3 candles from last winter," was the Arctic equivalent of "Karen never Venmo'd me back." Some families got creative. They'd make rushlights, basically reeds soaked in fat and lit on fire. They burned fast and smelled terrible, but they were cheap. Think of them as the Spirit Airlines of lighting. You used them when you had no other choice and complained the entire time. Churches, meanwhile, went through candles like a modern teenager goes through phone battery. Services required dozens of candles burning simultaneously for hours. The church was the one place in the village that was actually bright during the polar night, which is probably why attendance was so good. It wasn't just about salvation, it was about seeing your own hands in front of your face. Wealthy families, the ones with actual money, would import candles from the south. Fancy ones. Ones that didn't smell like death. This was a flex. Showing up to Christmas service with imported beeswax candles was the 1800s Arctic version of pulling up in a Tesla. But for most people it was homemade tallow or nothing. You'd light your candle in the morning, carry it from room to room like a tiny flickering security blanket, and ration your light like it was liquid gold. Because in a way, it was. You learned to do everything in the dimmest light possible, knitting by a candle 2 feet away, cooking by firelight with one candle as backup, reading, if you could read, with your face practically in the flame, squinting at letters that danced in the flicker. And when the candle burned down to a stub, you didn't throw it away. You saved it, melted it down, combined it with other stubs, made a new Frankenstein candle out of the remains. Nothing was wasted. Because in the Arctic winter, light wasn't a convenience, it was everything. Christmas preparations didn't start in December. They started in August, when you still remembered what the sun looked like. You dried fish, salted meat, brewed beer, and prayed your supplies would last. Because once the darkness hit, nobody was popping out to the store. The store was 3 days away by sleigh, and also closed because of a blizzard. This wasn't like modern Christmas prep where you panic buy wrapping paper on December 23rd and call it done. This was survival logistics masquerading as holiday planning. You weren't just preparing for a celebration. You were preparing to not starve in the dark for 3 months while also trying to make it festive. So in late summer, when the sun was still shining at midnight and you had energy and optimism, you started working. Fish were caught and hung on racks to dry in the open air. Cod in particular became hard as wooden planks. You could literally use dried cod as a weapon. People did, occasionally, during arguments, but mostly you soaked it later and ate it, because protein was protein. Meat was salted and stored in barrels. If you were lucky enough to slaughter a sheep or pig in the fall, you preserved every single part of it. Nothing was wasted. The fat became tallow for candles. The bones became broth. The organs became sausages that tasted like regret but kept you alive. Then there was the beer. Oh, the beer. Beer wasn't optional. Water could be contaminated. Milk froze. Beer was safe, caloric, and, let's be honest, necessary for surviving a winter where the sun ghosted you for 2 months. Families brewed huge batches in the fall, storing them in barrels in the coldest part of the house. It wasn't fancy craft IPA. It was thick, dark, somewhat chunky homebrew that tasted like bread and made you feel warm from the inside. Christmas beer, called juleøl in Norway, was brewed extra strong. You'd need it. Butter was another priority. Families churned and salted as much butter as they could, storing it in wooden containers. Butter was wealth. Butter was currency. Butter made everything taste less like survival. Running out of butter in January was a legitimate tragedy. Grain was stockpiled. Flour, barley, oats, whatever could be stored without spoiling. You'd use it to make flatbread, porridge, and the occasional sad biscuit when you were feeling fancy. Bread wasn't fluffy. It was dense, dark, and could double as a doorstop, but it kept you fed. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, potatoes, if you were in the right century, were stored in root cellars. These weren't Instagram-worthy vegetables. They were shriveled, dirt-covered, and honestly kind of suspicious-looking by December. But you ate them anyway, because scurvy was real, and you'd heard terrible things about what happened to people who didn't eat their vegetables. And then there was the planning for Christmas specifically. You couldn't just decide on December 20th that you wanted a feast. Everything had to be set aside months in advance. The best cuts of dried fish, the nicest salted lamb, the beer you didn't drink in November because you had self-control and fear of disappointing your ancestors. Women would start baking Christmas bread weeks ahead of time. Special breads with butter and spices, if you could afford spices, which most people couldn't. These breads were stored in the cold, wrapped in cloth, and brought out on Christmas Eve like edible treasure. Families also gathered evergreen branches in early winter before the snow got too deep. These would be used for decorations, but also for their symbolic importance. Evergreens stayed green through winter. They represented life, endurance, hope. You needed that symbolism when your world was frozen and black. By the time December arrived and the polar night swallowed the village whole, you were either ready or you weren't. There were no second chances, no late-night grocery runs, no Amazon Prime. You'd done the work in the light so you could survive and celebrate in the dark. And if you'd planned well, Christmas would be magical. If you hadn't, Christmas would be a very long, very hungry reminder that preparation matters. Either way, you weren't going anywhere. Forget Pinterest-perfect wreaths. Arctic Christmas decor was spruce branches, straw, and maybe a ribbon if you were fancy. People hung evergreen boughs not for aesthetics, but because they symbolised life in a season where everything else was dead or trying to be. Also, they smelled better than the goat living in the corner of your house. Let's be clear, you weren't decorating to impress guests. You were decorating because humans need beauty to survive, and when you're living in 24-hour darkness with the same 7 people you've seen every day for 6 months, a spruce branch hanging from the ceiling counts as interior design. Evergreens were the MVPs of Arctic Christmas decor. Spruce, pine, juniper. Anything that stayed green through winter became sacred. People believed these plants held magical properties, that they could ward off evil spirits and trolls who got extra active during the dark months. So you'd venture out into the frozen forest, hack off some branches with numb fingers, and drag them back home like you'd just won the lottery. These branches were hung everywhere, over doorways to protect against malicious spirits entering your home, from the ceiling beams to remind everyone that life still existed somewhere under the snow, around the windows, even though the windows only showed darkness, because hope is a decorating philosophy. Then there was straw. So much straw. Straw was woven into intricate designs, stars, goats, hearts, geometric shapes that looked like someone had a fever dream about triangles. These weren't just crafts, they were tradition. Families would sit together in the candlelight, weaving straw into Christmas ornaments while telling stories and trying not to go insane from cabin fever. Children made straw stars to hang in the windows. Adults made straw goats, representations of Thor's goats from pagan tradition, that doubled as a nod to the old gods just in case the Christian god was too busy to notice the Arctic. If you had red fabric or ribbon, you were basically royalty. A single red ribbon could transform a plain spruce branch into a whole event. You'd tie it carefully, making it last, rationing festivity like you rationed everything else. Red symbolised life, warmth, blood, all the things that were in short supply when the world outside was frozen and black. Some families, if they were wealthy or had connections to the south, might have glass ornaments. These were imported treasures, delicate and expensive, wrapped carefully and brought out only for Christmas. Breaking one was a minor catastrophe. Children weren't allowed to touch them. Honestly, adults barely touched them. They just hung there, glittering in the candlelight, reminding everyone that beauty still existed in the world. Candles themselves became decor, not just functional light sources, but arranged decoratively on windowsills and tables. The wealthier families would place candles in every window on Christmas Eve, a tradition meant to guide travellers through the darkness and also to show off that yes, they had candles to spare, thank you very much. And let's not forget the less glamorous decorations, drying herbs hanging from the rafters, strings of dried mushrooms, bundles of kindling stacked artistically by the fire. It wasn't planned, it was just life. But in the dim, flickering light of the cabin, it all looked intentional, rustic, cosy even. The floor was covered with fresh straw or juniper branches, not because it looked nice, but because it insulated against the cold and added a fresh scent to cover up the smell of unwashed humans and livestock sharing living quarters. But sure, let's call it festive floor decor. Some families carved wooden ornaments, simple shapes, painted if they had paint, left natural if they didn't. Stars, angels, reindeer. These were passed down through generations, accumulating scratches and chips and stories. Each ornament carried memory. Your grandmother made this one. Your uncle carved that one before he died at sea. The decorations weren't just pretty. They were history you could hang on a tree. Except there often wasn't a tree. Trees indoors weren't really a thing yet in many Arctic regions during the early 1800s. That tradition came later. So instead you hung your decorations from the ceiling beams, from shelves, from whatever horizontal surface existed. The result wasn't elegant, it wasn't cohesive. But when you lit all your candles on Christmas Eve and looked around your little cabin, spruce branches overhead, straw stars in the windows, the smell of evergreen mixing with wood smoke and baking bread, it felt like magic. Which, when you're living in eternal night, is exactly what you need. The Yule log was an actual log, a huge one. You dragged it inside, lit it on fire and kept it burning for as long as possible. Sometimes all 12 days of Christmas. It wasn't about ambience. It was about not freezing to death. If your Yule log went out early, that was considered bad luck, probably because you'd now have to go outside in the dark to find another one. Choosing the Yule log was serious business. You didn't just grab any random piece of wood. You needed something massive. Oak if you could find it, birch if you couldn't. The log had to be big enough to burn slowly, steadily for days. We're talking the trunk of a tree, not some sad branch you found near your house. This was a log that required multiple people to drag home, the kind that made you question your life choices halfway through hauling it. The search for the perfect Yule log happened before the polar night fully set in, back when you could still see what you were doing. Men would venture into the forest, scope out candidates, and debate the merits of different trees like they were shopping for cars. Too small? It'll burn out by December 27th and you'll look like a fool. Too big? Good luck getting it through your door. You wanted Goldilocks level perfection. Once you found the right log, you cut it down, which in Arctic winter meant swinging an axe with frozen hands while trying not to lose a toe. Then came the real fun, dragging this enormous piece of wood back to your cabin. Sometimes you used a sleigh. Sometimes you used sheer stubbornness and regret. Either way, by the time you got it home, you'd earned that log. The Yule log was brought inside on Christmas Eve with ceremony. This wasn't just firewood. This was the centerpiece of your holiday. The literal warmth that would carry your family through the darkest days of winter. Some families blessed it. Some sang songs. Some poured a bit of ale on it as an offering to whatever gods were still paying attention. Then you wedged it into your fireplace, which, let's be honest, was probably not designed for a log this size, and lit it using a piece of the previous year's Yule log, which you'd carefully saved for exactly this moment. It was tradition. It was continuity. It was also practical, because starting a fire from scratch in Arctic winter was miserable, and if you had a shortcut, you took it. Once lit, the goal was simple: keep it burning for 12 days. This required strategy. You didn't let it roar into a massive blaze. That would burn through it too fast. You wanted a slow, steady burn, a gentle, reliable heat that would keep your cabin warm enough that your breath didn't fog indoors. You'd adjust the log, rotate it, add smaller pieces of wood around it to keep the flames going, but the Yule log itself was the foundation. The anchor, the whole point. If the Yule log went out before Twelfth Night, it was bad luck. Not just oops, inconvenient bad luck. We're talking crop failure, illness, misfortune for the whole next year bad luck. So people took this seriously. Someone was always watching the fire, feeding it, babysitting it like an unpredictable toddler made of flame. At night, the Yule log was the only thing standing between you and the kind of cold that makes you wonder if your ancestors made a terrible mistake settling here. You'd sleep near it, huddle around it, dry your wet clothes on it, cook over it. The Yule log wasn't decor, it was a team member, a very hot, very important team member. And here's the beautiful part. The ashes from the Yule log were considered magical. People saved them and scattered them over their fields in spring to ensure a good harvest. Some kept a chunk of charred wood as protection against lightning strikes. Others mixed the ashes with water and gave it to sick livestock, because apparently that was medicine in the 1800s. The Yule log represented everything Christmas was supposed to be in the Arctic. Warmth, light, endurance, and the hope that if you could just keep the fire burning a little longer, you'd make it through to the other side. It's kind of poetic, actually. Also deeply stressful. Because if you woke up on December 28th and the fire was out, you had to face the cold, face your family's disappointment, and face the fact that you now had to go back outside, in the dark, in the cold, to find another massive log and start over. No pressure. Christmas in the Arctic was Christian, sure, but it was also extremely pagan. People still honoured Thor, left offerings for spirits, and believed that trolls roamed the darkness. A popular decoration, a straw goat representing Thor's chariot-pulling goats. It was like if your nativity scene also included a Viking superhero cameo. Here's the thing. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia relatively late, around the 10th and 11th centuries, and it didn't exactly wipe out 1,000 years of Norse tradition. Instead, the two religions kind of merged, like a cultural smoothie. You'd go to church on Christmas Eve, sing hymns about baby Jesus, and then come home and leave porridge out for the Nisa, a mischievous house spirit who'd burn your barn down if you forgot to feed him. The Yule goat, or Julebuk, was everywhere. Families wove them out of straw, creating intricate goat figures that ranged from tiny ornaments to massive sculptures that stood in the corner of the main room. These goats weren't just cute farm animals. They represented Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, Thor's two magical goats who pulled his chariot across the sky and could be eaten for dinner and then resurrected the next day, which honestly sounds like the ultimate meal prep. But the goat also had darker associations. In some villages, young men would dress up in goat costumes, full scary masks, horns, the works, and go door to door during Christmas demanding food and beer. It was like trick-or-treating, except the trick was genuine intimidation, and the treat was avoiding having your house haunted by pagan vengeance. People played along because, well, what if it actually was a spirit and not just your neighbour Lars under a sheepskin? Then there were the elves, not the jolly workshop elves, the hidden people, supernatural beings who lived in rocks, hills and forests. You didn't mess with them. During Christmas, it was especially important to stay on their good side, so families left out offerings, bowls of porridge, butter, bread, beer. You'd place them outside the door or near a specific rock that was known to house elves. Skipping this tradition was basically asking for your cow to go lame or your roof to collapse. The elves didn't forgive disrespect. Some families poured ale onto the ground before drinking, a toast to the old gods who might still be listening. Others marked their doorways with protective runes, just in case the church's blessings weren't enough to keep out the trolls, Draugr and other unsettling creatures that prowled the winter darkness. Speaking of trolls, everyone believed in them, not metaphorically, literally. Trolls lived in the mountains and came down during the darkest part of winter to cause trouble. They'd steal livestock, kidnap children, or just stand outside your window breathing heavily to freak you out. Christmas was a particularly active time for trolls, possibly because they were also miserable about the darkness and took it out on humans. To ward them off, people rang bells, sang loudly, kept fires burning, and made as much noise as possible. Silence was dangerous. Silence let the darkness in. So Christmas in the Arctic wasn't quiet and peaceful. It was loud, chaotic, and slightly paranoid in the best way. Churches tried to suppress these pagan practices, but mostly they just gave up and incorporated them. Priests would bless the Yule goat. They'd acknowledge the hidden people in sermons, framing them as God's mysterious creatures. It was easier than fighting centuries of tradition, and honestly, even the priests weren't entirely sure the elves weren't real. One particularly stubborn tradition was the Yule lad precursor beliefs. Spirits or gods who visited during the 12 days of Christmas. Different regions had different versions, but the idea was universal. During the darkest time of year, the boundary between the living world and the supernatural world grew thin. Spirits walked among humans, the dead could return. Magic was real, so people adapted. They went to church, yes. They prayed to Jesus, absolutely. But they also left porridge for the Nissi, hung straw goats in their homes, avoided angering the elves, and kept one eye on the darkness just in case something with glowing eyes and bad intentions was watching back. It wasn't contradictory to them. It was practical. Because when you live in a world where the sun abandons you for 2 months, where the cold can kill you in minutes, and where the darkness feels alive, you don't take chances. You honour every god, spirit, and supernatural being you can think of, just to be safe. And if that means your Christmas celebration includes both a nativity scene and a straw goat dedicated to Thor, so be it. The baby Jesus and the Norse gods could share the holiday. After all, they were both trying to bring light into the darkness. In Iceland, forget one Santa, you got 13. The Yule lads were 13 mischievous trolls who visited one per night leading up to Christmas. Each had a weird, specific hobby: stealing sausages, slamming doors, licking spoons. Children left shoes in the window, and if they were good, they got candy. If they were bad, a raw potato. Honestly, a raw potato in a shoe feels like psychological warfare. Let's break down this absolute chaos. The Yule lads weren't cute. They weren't jolly. They were the sons of Grilla, a terrifying mountain troll who ate misbehaving children, and they lived in the mountains with their parents and the aforementioned child-eating cat. Each Yule lad had a name that directly described his bizarre, hyper-specific criminal activity. First up, Stekkjastar, or Sheepcoat Clod. He arrived on December 12th. His whole thing? Harassing sheep. He'd sneak into the barn and try to nurse from the ewes, which is both weird and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, especially the sheep. Icelandic children knew that if they heard strange noises from the barn, Stekkjastar was in town. December 13th brought Giljagar, Gullygok, who hid in gullies waiting for a chance to sneak into the barn and steal milk. Not the milk in the house, the milk straight from the cow. He was very committed to fresh dairy. Then came Stufur Stubby on the 14th. He was abnormally short and stole pans to eat the crusty bits stuck to them. Imagine waking up and all your dirty dishes are missing because a small troll broke in and licked them clean. It's helpful, but is also a crime. December 15th, Thvurslika Spoonlicker. He was extremely thin because his diet consisted entirely of licking wooden spoons. He'd sneak into kitchens and lick every spoon he could find. In a time before dishwashers, this was both disgusting and technically stealing. Potaski Phil Potscraper showed up on the 16th. He stole leftovers from pots. Same energy as someone finishing the pizza you were saving in the fridge, except it's a troll, and it's the 1800s. December 17th brought Askaslikia, Bowl Licker, who hid under beds waiting for people to put down their bowls so he could lick them. Children were warned to never put their food down, or a troll would literally lick your bowl from under your bed. Great for encouraging kids to finish their meals, terrible for sleep. Herdaskelia, Door Slammer, arrived on the 18th. His hobby? Slamming doors, all night, loudly. Just walking around your house slamming every door he could find. It's the 1800s version of someone playing loud music at 3 a.m, except the DJ is a troll and you can't call the landlord. December 19th, Skier Gamer, Skier Gobbler. Skier is Icelandic yogurt, and this guy would break in and eat all of it. Every last bit. He was obsessed. He probably had great gut health, but he was still breaking and entering. Bjugna Krekir, Sausage Swiper, came on the 20th. He hid in the rafters and stole sausages that families hung up to smoke. Sausages were valuable. Losing them to a rafter troll was genuinely upsetting, not just annoying. December 21st brought Glugagagir, window peeper, who just looked through windows. That's it. That was his crime. He was a creep. He'd peer into homes and watch people. Icelandic children were told to behave or the window peeper would be watching them, which is horrifying and also probably traumatizing. Gatathefa, doorway sniffer, showed up on the 22nd with an abnormally large nose. He'd sniff around doorways trying to find laufabröd, traditional Icelandic Christmas bread. Once he smelled it, he'd steal it. He was basically a carb-seeking missile with nostrils. December 23rd, Kettkrokur, meat hook. He carried a hook and used it to steal meat. Just reached through windows or down chimneys with his hook and snagged whatever meat he could. Icelandic families had to hide their Christmas roasts or lose them to a troll with a grappling hook. Finally, on Christmas Eve came Katasnikir, candle stealer. He followed children around trying to steal their candles, which in the dead of winter darkness was genuinely evil. Candles were valuable. This guy was a menace. Now here's the deal. Each Yule lad stayed for 13 days, so by Christmas, all 13 were in town, simultaneously causing absolute chaos. Then, starting on December 25th, they left one per night in the same order they arrived. Children would place a shoe in the windowsill each night. If they'd been good, the visiting Yule lad left a small gift, candy, a piece of fruit, maybe a small toy. If they'd been bad, a raw potato, not a cooked potato, not mashed potatoes, a raw dirty potato, just sitting in your shoe. A reminder that you disappointed a troll. It's hard to overstate how effective this was as a behaviour management system. The Yule lads were Iceland's chaotic answer to Christmas magic, and honestly, they're perfect. Weird, specific, slightly threatening, and absolutely unforgettable. 13 trolls. 13 chances to get a potato. Merry Christmas. Iceland also had the Yule cat, a massive, terrifying cat that roamed the countryside eating anyone who didn't receive new clothes for Christmas. Not eating your leftovers, eating you. This was a legitimate fear. It was also a very effective way to make sure everyone finished their weaving before December. Fashion or death, choose wisely. Let's be very clear about what we're dealing with here. The Yule cat, or Jólakötturinn, wasn't a cute oversized tabby. This was a monstrous house-sized cat with glowing eyes that prowled the snowy darkness looking for people who hadn't received new clothing for Christmas. And when it found them, it ate them, whole, no trial, no second chances. Just teeth and darkness and regret. The legend was taken seriously. Parents told their children about the Yule cat the same way you'd warn someone about a natural disaster. Finish your weaving or the Yule cat will get you wasn't a metaphor. It was a genuine threat that shaped behaviour for months leading up to Christmas. Here's how it worked. In rural Iceland, wool was everything. Sheep were everywhere, which meant wool production was a year-round community effort. Everyone had to contribute. Shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving. Everyone. Children, adults, elderly folks. If you could hold a spindle, you were working. The rule was simple. If you worked hard on wool production throughout the year, you'd receive new clothing for Christmas. A new sweater, new socks, a new scarf. Something. It didn't have to be fancy. It just had to be new. That new clothing was proof that you'd contributed, that you'd done your part, that you deserved to survive the winter. But if you'd been lazy, if you'd slacked off while everyone else was spinning wool and weaving fabric, no new clothes for you, and that meant you were Yule cat food. The Yule cat legend served multiple purposes. First, it was economic. Iceland's wool industry was vital to survival. Everyone had to participate or the community suffered. The Yule cat was motivation. Second, it reinforced the value of hard work and contribution. You couldn't freeload. You had to earn your protection, literally, by working. And third, it was probably the most metal way to encourage textile production in human history. Imagine being a kid in 19th century Iceland. It's November, the darkness is closing in. Your fingers are sore from spinning wool for months. You're tired. You want to quit. And then your grandmother leans over and whispers, "Keep going, child. The Yule Cat is already sharpening its claws. You keep spinning. The Yule Cat was also associated with Grilla, the child-eating troll mother of the Yule lads. Some stories said the cat was her pet. Others said it worked independently, a freelance monster with its own agenda. Either way, it was bad news. On Christmas Eve, families would gather and show off their new clothes. Not to brag, to survive. You'd put on your new sweater, your new mittens, your new socks, and you'd feel relief wash over you. You were safe. The Yule Cat wouldn't come for you. You'd done your work, you'd earned your survival. But if someone in the village hadn't received anything new, maybe they were too poor, too sick, or just genuinely lazy, people worried. Quietly. Would the Yule Cat come for them? Should someone lend them a scarf just to be safe? Because the thing about the Yule Cat was that it didn't care about excuses. It didn't care if you were sick or struggling. No new clothes meant you were on the menu. This created a strange social safety net. Wealthier families, not wanting anyone in their village to be eaten by a giant supernatural cat, would sometimes gift clothing to poorer neighbours. Not out of pure charity, though that was part of it, but also out of a communal sense that if the Yule Cat showed up and found someone unprotected, it might just stick around and cause problems for everyone. So the Yule Cat, in a weird way, encouraged both hard work and generosity. Work hard to earn your own protection. Be generous to protect your neighbours, because nobody wanted to be the village that let someone get eaten by a cat the size of a barn. The imagery was vivid and terrifying. The Yule Cat was described as having eyes that glowed like lanterns in the dark. Its meow was a roar that echoed through valleys. Its paw prints in the snow were the size of wagon wheels. When it walked, the ground trembled. When it hunted, there was nowhere to hide. Children would lie awake on Christmas Eve listening to the wind howl outside, wondering if that sound was just weather or if it was the Yule Cat prowling nearby, sniffing for anyone foolish enough to be caught without new wool. And in the morning, when you woke up safe and warm in your new sweater, you'd breathe a sigh of relief. You'd survived. The Yule Cat had passed you by. For now. Going to Christmas service meant bundling in every layer you owned, grabbing a lantern, and walking through pitch-black cold to a wooden church that was barely warmer than outside. The service was long. The benches were hard. Your breath made clouds indoors. But you went because missing church on Christmas was both sinful and a way to guarantee troll activity at your house. Preparation for church started hours before the service. You'd layer everything: wool undergarments, wool shirt, wool sweater, wool outer coat, wool scarf, wool mittens. You looked like a walking sheep. You could barely move your arms. But frostbite was real, and losing fingers to prove you were fashionable was a bad trade. Women wrapped their heads in shawls, sometimes 2 or 3 layers. Men pulled fur hats down over their ears. Children were bundled until only their eyes showed, like tiny Arctic mummies. Everyone wore their best clothes underneath all the wool, because this was Christmas, and God could see through your layers, obviously. Then came the walk. If you lived in the village, lucky you. The church was maybe a 5-minute walk, but most families lived on scattered farms, which meant travelling anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours through frozen darkness. You carried lanterns made of tin with candles inside, the tiny flames flickering as you walked. These lanterns barely illuminated 3 feet in front of you. Beyond that, pure void. You walked in groups. Always. Walking alone at night during the polar darkness was asking to get lost, freeze to death, or, according to local belief, get snatched by trolls or hidden people who didn't appreciate humans wandering through their territory. So families grouped together, sometimes multiple families, creating a small constellation of lantern light moving slowly through the snow. The cold was immediate and vicious. Even bundled, you felt it seeping through the layers. Your nose ran, your eyes watered, your lungs burned with every breath. Children cried, adults gritted their teeth. Everyone kept walking because turning back wasn't an option. You'd already committed. Plus your ancestors did this. Your grandparents did this. You could do this. Probably. When you finally arrived at the church, you stamped the snow off your boots and stepped inside, expecting warmth. You did not find warmth. The church had a fire. Sure, but it was a small fire in a large wooden building with gaps in the walls and zero insulation. The fire kept the space from being literally frozen, but that was it. You could still see your breath. The benches were ice-cold wood that hurt to sit on. You kept your coat on. Everyone did. The church itself was beautiful in a stark, haunting way. Wooden beams overhead, simple and unadorned. Walls painted white, if they were painted at all. Candles everywhere, on the altar, along the walls held by parishioners. This was the one night where the church used every candle it had, creating a warm golden glow that pushed back the darkness just enough to feel sacred. The service was in Latin, which most people didn't understand. The priest chanted prayers that echoed in the cold air. The congregation responded with memorized phrases, their voices blending into a low rhythmic hum. It was hypnotic, meditative. You couldn't understand the words, but you understood the feeling. This was holy. This mattered. Then came the hymns. Oh, the hymns. Singing in the Arctic church on Christmas Eve was a full-body experience. Everyone sang, loudly. Your breath turned to fog as you sang, creating clouds that rose toward the ceiling like prayers made visible. The acoustics were incredible. Wooden walls and high ceilings turned even rough peasant voices into something angelic. For a few minutes, in the cold and the dark, surrounded by candlelight and song, you felt something bigger than yourself. The sermon was long. Very long. Priests knew they had a captive audience. Nobody was leaving early when it was pitch black and freezing outside. So they preached. About sin. About redemption. About the miracle of Christ's birth. About being good neighbours and not stealing your neighbour's livestock, even though you really wanted to. The benches had no cushions. Your back ached. Your legs went numb. Children fell asleep on their parents' laps. Adults zoned out and thought about the food waiting at home. But you stayed. Because this was the event. This was the moment that marked Christmas as real, as official. You'd walked through darkness to get here. You'd suffered through cold. You'd endured a 2-hour service on a wooden plank. That suffering was part of the point. Easy worship didn't count. You had to earn it. When the service finally ended, there was communion, bread and wine, which tasted extraordinary when you'd been sitting in freezing temperatures for 2 hours. Then the priest blessed everyone, wished them a holy Christmas, and sent them back into the night. The walk home felt different, lighter somehow. You'd done it. You'd honoured Christmas properly. God had seen your effort. The trolls couldn't touch you now. You clutched your lantern, walked with your family and neighbours, and headed back through the darkness toward home, where the fire was waiting, and the Christmas feast, and warmth. And as you walked, someone would start singing a hymn, then others would join, voices carrying through the black frozen landscape proclaiming light and hope in a world that had none. It was defiant. It was beautiful. It was Christmas in the dark. Christmas dinner in the Arctic was elaborate by local standards, which means it included fish you dried in September, porridge, flatbread and butter if you were wealthy. Maybe some cured mutton. Possibly beer. The goal wasn't Michelin stars, the goal was calories. If you could chew it and it didn't kill you, it was festive. Let's set the scene. You've just returned from church. Your face is numb. Your fingers might be frostbitten, you can't feel your toes, but inside your cabin the fire is roaring, candles are lit everywhere, and the smell of food, actual, real food, fills the air. This is it. This is the moment you've been rationing and preparing for since August. The table, if you had one, was laid out with everything your family had saved. If you didn't have a table, you used a plank of wood balanced on supports, or you just ate sitting on the floor near the fire. Furniture was optional, food was not. The centrepiece was always fish. Dried cod, specifically. Stockfish. The stuff that had been hanging outside since September. Hard as a baseball bat, looking like something you'd use to defend yourself rather than eat. But you'd soaked it for days, boiled it until it softened, and now it sat there. Pale, flaky, and honestly kind of sad-looking, but packed with protein. You ate it with butter if you had butter, which made it almost pleasant. Without butter, it tasted like chewy ocean cardboard. You ate it anyway. Some families had salted herring or dried haddock. Same concept, slightly different fish. The point was, fish was survival. Fish was abundant. Fish kept you alive when nothing else would. So fish was Christmas dinner, and you were grateful for it. Then there was porridge. Thick, creamy, made from barley or oats cooked in milk or water. sweetened with a tiny bit of honey or butter if you were fancy. Porridge was warm. Porridge was filling. Porridge didn't taste like much, but it sat in your stomach like ballast and kept you warm from the inside. A good porridge could carry you through a day of doing nothing but existing in the cold. Some families hid a single almond in the Christmas porridge. Whoever found it would have good luck for the coming year. Children shoveled porridge into their mouths at dangerous speeds, hoping to find the almond. Adults pretended not to care, but also chewed very carefully just in case. Flatbread was everywhere. Thin, crispy, unleavened bread that lasted forever and tasted like nutritious cardboard. You broke off pieces and used them to scoop up fish or porridge or butter. Flatbread was the utensil, the side dish, and the filler. It was the duct tape of Arctic cuisine. If your family had done well that year, if the fishing was good, if the sheep survived, if nobody died unexpectedly, you might have mutton. Salted, cured mutton that had been hanging in the cold storage since fall. It was tough. It was salty. It required serious jaw strength to chew. But it was meat, and meat was luxury, and having meat at Christmas meant you'd made it. You were doing okay. You carved thin slices and savoured every bite like it was filet mignon, because in your world, it basically was. Butter was wealth. If you had butter on the table at Christmas, you were rich. Not own a castle rich, but we will survive winter comfortably rich. Butter made everything better. Butter on flatbread. Butter on fish. Butter in porridge. Butter eaten straight off a knife because you'd earned it and nobody could judge you. Root vegetables appeared if you'd stored them well. Turnips, carrots, maybe potatoes if you were in the right century and region. They'd been sitting in your root cellar for months and looked rough, wrinkled, slightly suspicious, but you boiled them and mashed them with butter and they became edible, sometimes even good. Then there was beer, homebrewed, thick, dark beer that tasted like fermented bread because that's essentially what it was. Christmas beer was brewed stronger than everyday beer. It was called juleøl in Norway, and it was mandatory. You drank it with dinner. You drank it after dinner. You toasted the old gods, the new god, your family, your neighbours, your livestock, and anyone else you could think of. Beer made the cold more tolerable. Beer made your relatives more tolerable. Beer was essential. Some families had dried fruit, apples, berries, saved from summer and rationed carefully. A handful of dried berries at Christmas felt like candy. Children hoarded them. Adults pretended to share. Cheese, if you had it, was another luxury. Hard cheese that had aged for months, strong-flavoured and dense. You cut tiny slices and made them last because cheese didn't come round often. The feast wasn't served all at once. It stretched over hours. You ate slowly, talked, sang, told stories, and then ate more. There was no rushing. Where were you going? Outside into the frozen void? No. You were staying right here, by the fire, eating dried fish and feeling like royalty. And here's the thing. It worked. Despite the simplicity, despite the fact that most of the food was some variation of dried, salted or preserved, it felt like a feast. Because context is everything. When you've been rationing food for months, when you've been cold and dark and tired, when you've worked all year just to get to this moment, dried fish tastes like victory. You weren't comparing it to a Thanksgiving turkey or a glazed ham. You were comparing it to every other meal this winter, which was probably just porridge and flatbread. By that standard, this was extraordinary. So you ate, you drank, you celebrated, and for one night, in the darkness, surrounded by your family and the glow of candlelight, you had everything you needed. Let's talk about lutefisk. This was dried fish soaked in lye. Yes, lye, the chemical used to unclog drains, until it turned into a gelatinous, translucent, jiggly nightmare. Then you boiled it and ate it. For Christmas. Some people loved it. Most people tolerated it. Everyone agreed it smelled like a crime scene. Here's how you made lutefisk. In case you ever want to replicate this experience, which you don't, first you took dried cod, the same rock-hard stockfish that had been hanging outside for months. You could build a house with this fish. You could use it as a weapon. It was indestructible. Then you soaked it in cold water for several days to rehydrate it. The fish would soften slightly, returning from fossilized to merely very firm. This was the reasonable part of the process. This was where things still made sense. But then, and this is where Nordic ancestors made a decision that haunts their descendants to this day, you took that rehydrated fish and soaked it in lye. Lye. Caustic soda. The same chemical used to make soap, clean ovens and dissolve organic matter. You submerged your food in it for several more days. Why? Honestly, nobody's entirely sure. Some say it was a preservation method. Others say it was a way to make dried fish edible during the lean winter months when you'd already eaten all the regular dried fish and were desperate. Some historians suggest it started as an accident. Maybe fish stored near lye used for soap making absorbed the chemical, and someone was hungry enough to try eating it anyway. Whatever the origin, it became tradition. And tradition, in the Arctic, is non-negotiable. The lye broke down the fish proteins, turning the firm white flesh into something translucent and gelatinous. It looked like fish-flavoured jello. It jiggled. It was see-through. When you touched it, it had the structural integrity of a wet napkin. The fish swelled up, absorbing the lye solution, becoming bloated and slippery. Then you had to soak it again, this time in regular water for several more days, to remove the lye, because eating lye will kill you. This was important. People who rushed this step or didn't change the water enough ended up with lutefisk that was still caustic. It would burn your mouth. Literally. You'd know you messed up when your tongue started tingling in a way that wasn't festive. Once the lye was, hopefully, fully removed, you boiled the fish. It fell apart immediately. It became even more gelatinous. It turned opaque white, but maintained its unsettling jiggle. You'd lift it out of the pot with a slotted spoon, and it would quiver on the plate like it was nervous about being eaten. Which fair. The smell. Oh, the smell. Lutefisk smelled like a combination of fish, chemicals, and regret. It filled the entire house. You couldn't escape it. Your clothes smelled like it. Your hair smelled like it. Visitors could tell from outside that someone was making lutefisk. It was pungent, vaguely soapy, and deeply fishy all at once. Imagine a fish that died in a swimming pool and then haunted the building. But here's the thing. On Christmas, you ate it anyway. You served it with butter, lots of butter, which helped mask both the flavour and the texture. Some people added mustard or a white sauce. Others boiled potatoes and mashed them into the lutefisk to create a unified mass that was easier to swallow. You didn't really chew lutefisk. It had no structural integrity. You just kind of moved it around your mouth and then swallowed. Children hated it. They made faces, they gagged. Parents told them to eat it anyway because this was tradition. And also because there wasn't anything else, so it was lutefisk or hunger. Most chose lutefisk, barely. Some people genuinely loved it. These people had acquired the taste over years, or possibly had something wrong with their taste buds. They'd eat multiple servings, praising the delicate flavour and smooth texture. Everyone else nodded politely and wondered if these people were okay. The texture was the real issue. It wasn't fish anymore. It wasn't solid. It was gelatinous, slippery, and it slid down your throat like a cold, fishy ghost. It was like eating a fish-flavoured loogie. There's no delicate way to describe it. Lutefisk also had a strange chemical aftertaste, a slight bitterness that lingered no matter how much butter you used. Your mouth felt weird after eating it, slightly tingly, vaguely soapy. You drank beer to wash it down, which helped, but the memory remained. And yet families served it every Christmas. Why? Because their parents served it, and their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. It was tradition. It was heritage. It was proof that your ancestors survived on truly questionable food, and you could too. Lutefisk was a test, a rite of passage. If you could eat lutefisk and not complain, you were tough. You were Norwegian. You were prepared for anything winter could throw at you, because if you could swallow lye-soaked jellyfish and call it dinner, you could survive anything. There's also something beautifully absurd about it. In the darkest, coldest time of year, when life is hard and bleak, Norwegians looked at dried fish, looked at industrial chemicals and said, let's combine these and call it delicacy. It's defiance. It's humour. It's the culinary equivalent of laughing in the face of winter, and honestly, that's very on brand for people who celebrated Christmas in 24-hour darkness. Lutefisk wasn't good, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Aquavit was the Arctic's gasoline, a strong caraway-flavoured liquor designed to warm you from the inside and make you forget that the sun abandoned you. People drank it before meals, during meals, after meals, and whenever someone mentioned going outside, it tasted like a burning forest, and everyone pretended to enjoy it. The name aquavit comes from the Latin aqua vitae, meaning water of life, which is ironic because drinking enough of it would absolutely kill you, but in small frequent doses throughout a long Arctic winter, it kept you warm, kept you sane, and kept you from thinking too hard about the fact that the sun had been gone for 6 weeks. Aquavit was traditionally made from potatoes or grain, whatever was available, and distilled into a clear, high-proof spirit. Then came the flavouring. Caraway seeds, always, plus dill, fennel, anise, coriander, or whatever herbs and spices the family had access to. Each family had their own recipe, passed down through generations, and each one claimed theirs was the best. They were all lying. They all tasted like drinking a spice cabinet. The alcohol content was high, very high. We're talking 40% to 50% ABV. This wasn't wine you sipped delicately. This was fuel. One shot of aquavit hit your stomach like a small explosion, radiating warmth outward to your frozen extremities. Your eyes watered. Your throat burned. Your chest felt like you'd swallowed a lit candle. And then, a few seconds later, you felt warm. Actually warm. For the first time in hours. Christmas aquavit was special. Families saved their best batch for the holidays, the bottles that had been aging since last winter. Some people aged aquavit in oak barrels, which mellowed the flavour slightly. Others just kept it in ceramic jugs in the cold storage, where it sat and got stronger and angrier over time. The drinking ritual was important. You didn't just gulp aquavit like a barbarian. You poured a small glass, a proper aquavit glass if you had one, which was basically a tiny cup designed to hold just enough liquor to warm you without immediately destroying you. You raised the glass, made eye contact with everyone at the table and said, "Skål!" Then you drank it in one go. No sipping. No hesitation. Down it went. Then you exhaled. Hard. Because holding that burn in your chest was impossible. Your face contorted. Your eyes squeezed shut. You might have made a noise, something between a cough and a gasp. And then you smiled, nodded, and said, "Good batch this year." Everyone knew you were lying. You knew you were lying. But this was tradition, and tradition required you to pretend that drinking liquid fire was pleasant. The first shot was always the worst. It burned like hell. Your body reacted with shock, trying to figure out why you just poisoned yourself. But the second shot, easier. The third, downright smooth. By the fourth, you genuinely believed you enjoyed the taste of caraway-infused paint thinner. By the fifth, you were warm, happy, and convinced that the polar night wasn't so bad after all. Aquavit wasn't just for Christmas dinner. It was a constant companion throughout the winter. Heading out to check on the animals, take a shot of aquavit first. Coming back inside after chopping wood, shot of aquavit. Neighbour stopping by for a visit, aquavit. Feeling sad about the darkness, aquavit. Feeling happy about literally anything, also aquavit. It was social glue. Offering someone aquavit was hospitality. Refusing aquavit was rude unless you had a very good reason, like being a child or actively dying. Even then, people might offer it as medicine, because aquavit was also used medicinally. Got a cold? Aquavit. Sore throat? Aquavit. Stomachache? Aquavit. Frostbite? Aquavit. Both internally and rubbed on the affected area, which probably didn't help, but at least you felt warm. It was the Arctic's cure-all, the way Windex fixes everything in my big fat Greek wedding. The taste itself was polarising. Caraway is a strong flavour. It's the dominant taste in rye bread, and in aquavit it's even more intense. You also got herbal, slightly medicinal notes from the other spices. Some batches were smooth. Others tasted like you were drinking a Christmas tree. Either way, it wasn't subtle. But here's the psychological magic. After a few weeks of drinking aquavit regularly, your brain started associating that burning herbal taste with warmth and comfort. You'd smell it and feel warmer. You'd taste it and feel at home. It became Pavlovian. Aquavit meant safety. Aquavit meant family. Aquavit meant you were going to survive this winter. At Christmas dinner, the aquavit flowed freely. Toasts happened constantly. To family. To health. To the animals. To neighbours. To the sun, wherever it was hiding. To Thor, just in case. To Jesus, obviously. To anyone who died that year. to everyone who hadn't. You found reasons to toast because toasting meant drinking, and drinking meant warmth and joy and forgetting that it was pitch black outside and would be for another month. By the end of Christmas dinner, everyone was warm, loose, and happy. The fish tasted better. The stories were funnier. The singing was louder. The darkness outside didn't seem so oppressive. This was the point. This was what aquavit was for. Some people overdid it. Uncle Bjorn would get too enthusiastic and pass out by the fire. Aunt Ingrid would start crying about her late husband. Someone would try to go outside to check on something and would have to be physically stopped because wandering drunk into the Arctic night was a death sentence. But mostly, aquavit just brought people together. It loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions enough that people actually talked, laughed, and connected. In a season defined by darkness, cold, and isolation, that connection was everything. So yes, aquavit tasted like punishment, but it felt like love. And in the Arctic winter, that was the best gift you could give. Caroling wasn't just charming, it was necessary. Music kept spirits up, literally. People believed that singing kept evil spirits and trolls away during the vulnerable darkness. So villagers gathered around candlelight and sang, loudly. If you couldn't sing well, you sang anyway. The trolls didn't care about pitch. Music in the Arctic winter wasn't entertainment, it was survival technology. When the darkness pressed in from all sides and the cold seeped into your bones, and the isolation made you question reality, singing reminded you that you were human, you were alive, and you weren't alone. Christmas carols in Norway, Finland, and Iceland were different from the cheerful jingles you hear in modern shopping malls. These were old hymns, slow, haunting melodies that had been passed down for centuries. They were sung in the local language, sometimes in Latin, and they carried weight. These weren't songs about reindeer or snowmen. They were about miracles, salvation, light breaking through darkness, and the promise that suffering wouldn't last forever. Perfect themes for people living in 24-hour night. The carols were sung everywhere. At church, obviously, but also at home around the fire. In groups visiting neighbours, while doing chores, while walking through the snow, singing structured time when time had lost all meaning. It marked moments. It created rhythm in a season that had none. One of the most important traditions was going caroling as a group. Not the cute modern version where you knock on doors and sing one verse of Jingle Bells. This was serious business. Families and neighbours bundled up, grabbed their lanterns and walked from house to house through the frozen darkness, singing at each door. The walking itself was treacherous. Snow-covered paths, ice, darkness so complete you couldn't see your own feet. But you kept walking, kept singing, because this was community. This was how you reminded each other that you all existed, that you were all in this together. When you arrived at a neighbour's house, you'd stand outside in the cold and sing, loudly. Your breath turned to fog, your voice cracked from the cold. Your fingers were too numb to feel the lantern you were holding, but you sang anyway because the family inside needed to hear it, and they did. Inside, the family would hear voices approaching through the darkness, faint at first, then growing louder, singing. Human voices piercing the silence. It was moving. It was proof that the world hadn't ended, that people still cared, that Christmas was real even in the void. The family inside would open their door, invite everyone in, and offer whatever hospitality they had. Aquavit, obviously, maybe some bread, a place by the fire to warm up for a few minutes. Then you'd sing together, the carolers and the family, cramming into the small cabin. Voices blending, candles flickering. The songs themselves were powerful. Det Herve Rose Sprungje was a Norwegian favourite, a medieval hymn about a rose blooming in the cold of winter, a metaphor for hope in darkness. The melody was simple, haunting, and designed to be sung by regular people, not professional singers. Everyone could join in. Glad Jul, Happy Yule, was another popular one, a folk song that mixed Christian themes with older pagan references to Yule. It was upbeat, rhythmic, and easier to sing when you'd had a few shots of aquavit. In Iceland, people sang Heims Bol and other hymns that acknowledged the harshness of winter while celebrating the miracle of Christ's birth. The lyrics were poetic, often melancholic, but the act of singing them together made them hopeful. Children learned these songs from birth. By the time you were 5, you knew all the words. By 10, you could sing harmony. By adulthood, these carols were embedded in your soul. You could sing them drunk, exhausted, half-frozen, or grief-stricken. They were always there. Singing also served a practical purpose. It kept trolls and spirits away. This wasn't superstition. It was deeply held belief. The darkness during polar night wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Evil things moved in it. Trolls, draugr, malevolent spirits. They thrived in silence and isolation. But music was light in audible form. It was human presence. It was community and faith and defiance all at once. Singing claimed the space. It said, "We are here. This is ours. You are not welcome." So people sang loudly. They sang constantly. They sang even when they were tired, even when their voices were hoarse, even when they weren't sure anyone was listening. Because maybe someone or something was. On Christmas Eve, after the feast, after the aquavit, after the stories, families would gather close to the fire and sing together one last time before bed. The candles were burning low. The room was warm. Everyone was full and tired and content. And in those moments, surrounded by family, singing old hymns in the flickering firelight while the darkness pressed against the windows, you felt safe. You felt connected. You felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The songs carried hopes that words alone couldn't express. They carried memories of Christmases past and prayers for Christmases future. They carried the voices of ancestors who'd sung these same songs in this same darkness generations ago. Singing wasn't just tradition. It was a lifeline. It was how you survived the dark, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, mentally. You sang because if you stopped singing, the silence would win. The darkness would win. The isolation would win. So you sang, loudly, off-key, with feeling. And the trolls stayed outside. Children didn't wake up to iPads. They woke up to carved wooden toys, knitted mittens, maybe a small piece of candy if they were lucky. A new pair of socks was a genuinely exciting gift, because frostbite was a real threat and wool was expensive. Honestly, socks saved lives. Socks were the MVP of Arctic Christmas. Let's be clear about expectations. Arctic children in the 1800s didn't write letters to Santa asking for the latest toy trends. They didn't have toy trends. They had things carved from wood by relatives who loved them, and things knitted from wool by relatives who didn't want them to die. Gift-giving wasn't about abundance. It was about thoughtfulness and survival, in that order. The most common gift was clothing. New socks, new mittens, a new hat, a new sweater. These weren't disappointing gifts. These were life-saving gifts wrapped in love, and many, many hours of labour. Your grandmother spent months knitting those socks. She spun the wool herself. She dyed it with plants she foraged in summer. She knitted by candlelight while telling you stories. Those socks represented hundreds of hours of work, and you needed them. Your old socks had holes. Your feet were cold constantly. Frostbite was a genuine risk, and losing toes wasn't a theoretical concern. It happened. So when you unwrapped those socks on Christmas morning, you felt genuine joy. Not fake, polite joy. Real. My feet will be warm. Joy. Mittens were similarly precious. Fingers were vulnerable. You needed mittens that actually worked, that kept the cold out, that didn't fall apart after a week. Hand-knitted mittens with intricate patterns weren't just beautiful. They were armour against the elements. Wooden toys were the other major category. Fathers, grandfathers and uncles spent winter evenings carving toys by firelight. Small horses, birds, dolls, spinning tops, tiny sleds. These weren't mass-produced. Each one was unique, carved with a knife from whatever wood was available, sanded smooth, sometimes painted if the family had paint. A carved wooden horse was a treasure. You played with it for years. You named it. You took it everywhere. When you outgrew it, you passed it down to your younger sibling, and eventually to your own children. These toys lasted generations, accumulating scratches and stories. Dolls were simpler, often just carved wooden figures with painted faces, maybe dressed in fabric scraps. They weren't realistic. They didn't have movable parts or detailed features, but they were yours, made with love, and they became companions during the long dark winters when there wasn't much else to do. Wealthy children, and we're talking relatively wealthy, like owns multiple cows, wealthy might receive imported toys, a tin soldier, a small book, a glass marble. These were exotic luxuries that other children would stare at with wonder. Candy was rare and magical. A single piece of hard candy, maybe flavoured with peppermint or anise, was a genuine treasure. You didn't eat it immediately, you savoured it. You made it last as long as possible, sucking on it slowly, rationing the sweetness. Some children saved their Christmas candy for weeks, taking it out occasionally just to look at it, to remember that sweetness existed in the world. Dried fruit, apples, berries, was another special treat. Fresh fruit in Arctic winter was impossible, but dried fruit carefully saved from summer was almost as good. A handful of dried lingonberries felt like luxury. You ate them one at a time, slowly, making the experience last. Some children received practical items that doubled as gifts. A new knife, for instance, was a significant present for an older boy. It meant you were trusted. You were growing up. You could help with real work now. It was a rite of passage disguised as a gift. Girls might receive a spindle or knitting needles signalling their transition into productive members of the household. It sounds grim by modern standards. Here's a gift, more work. But in context, it meant you were valued, trusted, and considered capable. Books were incredibly rare and incredibly precious. If a family owned even one book, it was probably a Bible or a hymnal, and it was treated like a sacred object. Receiving a book, any book, was an extraordinary gift. Children who could read would read the same book dozens of times, memorizing passages, studying illustrations, treating each page like treasure. One tradition in some families was the Christmas box, a small wooden box carved specifically to hold a child's treasures. The box itself was the gift, but it also represented the promise of future treasures to fill it. Children kept their few precious possessions inside, a pretty rock, a carved toy, maybe that piece of candy they were saving. The act of gift-giving happened on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, depending on the family. Parents would hide the gifts, usually under the table, behind the door, or tucked into the child's shoe that had been left in the window for the Yule lads. The moment of discovery was pure magic. In the dim candlelight, children would find their gifts and unwrap them, if they were wrapped at all, which they often weren't. Sometimes gifts were just placed out in the open, because wrapping paper was expensive and impractical. And here's the beautiful part. Children were genuinely thrilled. A new pair of socks, a carved wooden bird, a single piece of candy. These weren't consolation prizes. They were everything. Because Arctic children understood value in a way modern children often don't. They understood that someone spent months making these gifts. They understood that resources were limited. They understood that receiving anything at all was an act of love. There was no entitlement, no disappointment that they didn't get more, just gratitude. They'd clutch their new mittens and immediately put them on, showing them off to siblings. They'd play with their wooden toys right there by the fire, creating imaginary worlds. They'd save their candy, planning exactly when they'd eat it. And they'd hug their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever had made or given the gifts, with genuine appreciation. Because in the Arctic darkness, in the middle of winter, when survival was uncertain and comfort was rare, even the smallest gift was a reminder that you were loved, you were valued, and you were going to make it through. Socks weren't just socks, they were hope. Socializing in the polar night required commitment. You hitched up a sleigh, wrapped yourself in furs and navigated by starlight and memory to visit the neighbour 2 miles away. You brought food, beer, and small talk that could stretch for hours, because once you arrived, you weren't leaving until daylight, which wasn't coming. So you just stayed. The decision to visit neighbours wasn't made lightly. This wasn't, let's pop over for coffee. This was, let's risk our lives in sub-zero darkness to maintain human connection, because isolation will literally kill us. First, you had to prepare. The sleigh needed to be ready. Runners checked, harnesses inspected. The horse or reindeer fed and somewhat willing to cooperate. The animal was as unenthusiastic about this journey as you were, but both of you understood it was necessary. Then came the packing. You couldn't show up empty-handed. That would be unthinkable. You brought gifts, a loaf of bread, some dried fish, a bottle of homebrew, maybe some butter if you were feeling generous. These weren't just courtesy gifts. They were social currency. You'd remember who brought what and you'd reciprocate later. The whole community ran on this informal economy of generosity and obligation. You dressed in every warm thing you owned. Layers upon layers. Fur-lined coats. Woolen scarves wrapped around your face until only your eyes showed. Thick mittens. Boots stuffed with straw for extra insulation. You looked ridiculous. You looked like a walking pile of laundry, but you'd be warm and that's what mattered. The sleigh itself was packed with blankets, more furs, and maybe a heated stone wrapped in cloth to keep your feet from going numb during the journey. Some families brought a lantern, though in the open landscape with no trees to block the wind, lanterns often blew out. You relied more on starlight, and what starlight it was. On clear nights, the Arctic sky was breathtaking. With zero light pollution and the air crystal clear from the cold, the stars were so bright and numerous they looked fake. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a glowing river. Constellations you'd known since childhood guided your way. The North Star kept you oriented. If you were incredibly lucky, you'd see the northern lights, the aurora borealis dancing across the sky in ribbons of green, pink and purple. Locals had mixed feelings about the aurora. Some thought it was beautiful. Others thought it was the souls of the dead, or gods fighting, or spirits moving through the sky. Either way, it provided enough light to see by, which was helpful when you were trying not to drive your sleigh off a cliff. The journey was cold, brutally cold. Even wrapped in furs, the wind found every gap in your clothing. Your face hurt, your lungs burned with each breath. The cold was so intense it felt aggressive, like it was personally attacking you. But you kept going, because turning back wasn't an option. You'd already committed. Your neighbours were expecting you. Plus you were already halfway there, and going back meant facing this cold for the same amount of time with nothing to show for it. When you finally saw the dim glow of candlelight through a window in the distance, relief washed over you. You'd made it. Your neighbour was home. You weren't going to freeze to death in the wilderness tonight. You pulled up to the house, and before you could even climb down from the sleigh, the door opened. Your neighbours had heard the sleigh bells. Most sleighs had bells attached specifically so people could hear you coming through the dark. They rushed out to help you stable the horse, take your gifts, and usher you inside where it was warm. Well, warmer. Still cold by modern standards, but compared to outside it felt like paradise. And then came the hospitality. Oh, the hospitality. You were offered the best seat near the fire. Aquavit appeared immediately. You needed it to thaw out. Food was brought out even though they'd already eaten dinner. Didn't matter. You were a guest. You'd risked your life to visit. You were getting fed. The conversation started slow, catching up on news. How's your family? How are the animals? Did you lose anyone this winter? Any births? Any engagements? The big events of isolated rural life. Then the conversation deepened. Stories were told. Old memories shared. Gossip exchanged. Who was feuding with whom? Which family was struggling? Who needed help come spring? This wasn't idle chatter. This was information exchange. Community intelligence. You needed to know these things. Hours passed. The candles burned down. More aquavit appeared. The conversation became more animated, more philosophical, more ridiculous. Someone told a joke. Everyone laughed too hard. Someone else started singing, and soon everyone was singing. And then you'd realise it was late. Very late. Maybe midnight, maybe later. Hard to say because, again, time was meaningless. In summer, you'd leave. But this wasn't summer. Going outside now meant navigating in even colder temperatures, possibly with worse visibility if clouds had rolled in. Your horse was tired. You were tired. And honestly, your host didn't want you to leave either, because they'd worry about you freezing to death on the way home. So the invitation came. Just stay. Sleep here tonight. Leave in the morning. Except there was no morning. Not visually, but morning meant after we've all slept, which was close enough. You accepted because refusing would be both rude and stupid. Your host cleared space near the fire. brought out extra blankets, and you slept there with your coat still on, surrounded by the warmth of hospitality and the knowledge that human connection, real, face-to-face, committed human connection, was worth every frozen minute of the journey. And in the morning, or what passed for morning, you'd share breakfast, say your goodbyes, bundle back up, and make the journey home, already planning when you'd do this again. Because isolation killed people in the Arctic, not dramatically but slowly through depression and despair. Visiting neighbours, committing to that cold, dark journey, was how you survived. Not just physically, emotionally. With no sun and limited candles, entertainment was storytelling. Elders told tales of trolls, ghosts, hidden people, and ancient kings. These stories were long, dramatic, and included sound effects. Children sat mesmerised. Adults pretended not to be scared. Everyone agreed that trolls were definitely real and probably outside right now. In the Polar Night, storytelling wasn't a hobby. It was infrastructure. It was how knowledge passed down. It was how time passed. It was how you stayed sane when the darkness pressed in, and there was nothing to do but exist in a small, cold room with the same people you'd been stuck with for months. Every family had designated storytellers, usually the grandparents, but sometimes an aunt or uncle with a gift for drama. These people were valued. They were entertainment, education, and cultural preservation all in one. If you could tell a good story, you had power. The stories fell into several categories, each serving different purposes. First, there were the saga stories, historical tales about Norwegian kings, Icelandic settlers, Viking warriors, and legendary heroes. These were long, multi-night epics that could stretch for hours. The storyteller would recount battles, betrayals, romances, and feuds with incredible detail. These sagas were memorized, passed down verbally for generations, and they were taken seriously. This was history. This was heritage. You learned who your ancestors were and what they'd accomplished. Children listened wide-eyed as grandparents described Viking raids, blood feuds that lasted generations, and heroes who fought giants and monsters. These weren't bedtime stories, they were identity. You learned that you came from tough people, people who survived impossible odds, and therefore you could too. Then there were the troll stories. Oh, the troll stories. Trolls were everywhere in Arctic folklore. They lived in the mountains. They came down during winter darkness. They were huge, ugly, and dangerous. Some turned to stone in sunlight, which was comforting in theory but irrelevant when the sun hadn't shown up for 2 months. The storyteller would lower their voice, lean in close to the fire, and begin. One winter, darker than most, a troll came down from the mountains. Children scooted closer together. Even adults paid attention because everyone had heard stories from people who claimed to have seen trolls. Your uncle swore he saw one. Your neighbour's grandmother said one tried to take her baby. These weren't fairy tales. These were warnings. The best storytellers used sound effects. They'd slam their hand on the table when the troll knocked on the door. Boom. Children would jump. They'd lower their voice to a growl when the troll spoke. They'd make scratching sounds when the troll clawed at the walls. It was theatre. It was immersive. It was absolutely terrifying. And after the story ended, when it was time for bed, children would lie awake listening to every creak of the house, every sound of the wind, convinced that a troll was outside. Parents would reassure them, but even parents would glance at the door just to make sure. Ghost stories were equally popular. The Arctic had plenty of ghost lore. Draugr, the undead who haunted their burial mounds. Huldufolk, the hidden people who'd curse you if you disrespected their homes. Spirits of sailors who died at sea and wandered the coast looking for home. These stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They reinforced social rules. Don't wander alone in the dark. Don't disrespect sacred places. Don't steal. Don't lie. Because if you do, the ghosts will come for you. Or the trolls. Or the hidden people. Fear kept people in line when law enforcement was non-existent. Then there were the cautionary tales. Stories about real people who made bad decisions and paid for it. The man who went out drunk in a blizzard and froze to death. The woman who had an affair and was ostracised. The family who didn't prepare for winter and starved. These stories were grim, but they taught survival. They reinforced community values. They reminded you that decisions had consequences. Comic stories existed too, thank goodness. Funny tales about foolish neighbours, clever farmers who outwitted trolls, or absurd misunderstandings that led to chaos. Laughter was medicine. It broke the tension of the darker stories. It reminded everyone that humour existed even in the bleakest circumstances. The storytelling sessions had rhythm. The elder would start with something light, maybe a funny anecdote from their youth. Then they'd move into a historical saga, something long and complex. Then, as the night deepened and the candles burned low, they'd shift to something darker. Ghosts, trolls, supernatural encounters. The timing was deliberate. You didn't tell troll stories early in the evening when children might have to walk across the room to bed. You saved them for when everyone was already settled, bundled close to the fire, safe in proximity to each other. Storytellers had techniques. They'd pause at critical moments, letting the tension build. They'd make eye contact with listeners, drawing them in. They'd change their voice for different characters, high-pitched for women, gruff for trolls, regal for kings. Some were naturally gifted. Others worked at it for years, perfecting their craft. Children learned by watching. They'd hear the same stories dozens of times, memorising them, until eventually they could tell them too. By the time you were an adult, you had a mental library of stories ready to share with your own children. These stories weren't written down. Books were rare and expensive. Literacy was limited. Everything was oral tradition, kept alive by memory and repetition. This meant stories changed over time. Details added, embellished, adjusted. But the core remained. And here's what's beautiful. These stories connected generations. The tale your grandfather told was the same tale his grandfather told. You were hearing the exact same story your ancestors heard centuries ago, told in the same language, in the same darkness, around the same kind of fire. It was continuity. It was immortality. It was proof that even in the darkest times, humans create light through words. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. It was how you passed the time, preserved your culture, taught your children, and reminded yourself that you were part of something bigger than one long dark winter. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the darkness felt alive, a good story was the only thing standing between you and despair. So you told stories, and you listened, and you survived. Knitting wasn't a hobby. It was an economic necessity and a social event. Women gathered to knit socks, sweaters, mittens, anything that could keep a human alive. They knitted by firelight, singing or telling stories, their needles clicking in rhythm. If you didn't know how to knit in the Arctic, you'd learn fast or freeze slowly. Let's talk numbers. An average Arctic family needed approximately 12 pairs of socks per person per winter. That's not because people were extravagant, it's because wool socks wore out. They developed holes, they got wet, froze and became unusable. You needed backups, and backups for your backups. Now multiply that by 5 to 7 family members. You're looking at 60 to 84 pairs of socks per winter, every winter. Then add mittens, sweaters, scarves, hats, blankets, and underlayers. The knitting never stopped. It couldn't. Your family's survival depended on a constant supply of wool goods. Girls learned to knit around age 4 or 5, sometimes earlier. By age 7, they could knit a basic sock. By 10, they were producing usable items regularly. By adulthood, they could knit in the dark, by feel alone, while carrying on a conversation and watching children at the same time. It wasn't optional. It was like learning to walk or talk. If you were female in the Arctic, you knitted, period. But here's the thing. It wasn't done in isolation. Knitting was deeply social. Women gathered in what were called knitting circles or evening work gatherings, regular meetups where they'd bring their projects and work together. These gatherings happened in someone's home, usually rotating between families. You'd arrive in the evening after dinner, carrying your knitting basket with your current project, your needles and extra wool. The host would have the fire going strong, candles lit, and space cleared for everyone to sit. Then you'd knit. For hours, sometimes until midnight or later. The needles clicked in a rhythmic symphony. Dozens of needles working at once, creating a sound that was both industrial and soothing. Click, 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 click. Constant. Meditative. But you weren't just knitting. You were talking. Gossiping. Sharing news. Complaining about husbands. Discussing whose daughter was engaged, whose son was causing trouble, who needed help with their farm work come spring. This was how information flowed through the community. This was the original social network. Someone would start singing and others would join. Work songs, folk songs, hymns, anything with a rhythm that matched the knitting. The music helped everyone work at the same pace and made the hours pass faster. Sometimes the singing would shift into storytelling. Someone would launch into a tale while everyone else knitted and listened. The skill level varied wildly. Older women were masters. Their hands moved so fast the needles blurred. They could knit complex patterns without looking. Cables, colour work, intricate designs that required counting stitches and switching colours. These weren't just functional items, they were art. Younger women worked on simpler projects, basic socks, plain scarves. They'd watch the older women, learning techniques, asking questions. How do you turn the heel? What's the trick to keeping tension even? Knowledge passed directly from expert to novice, right there by the fire. Some patterns were specific to families or regions. You could look at someone's mittens and know exactly where they were from based on the pattern. These designs weren't written down. They were memorized, passed through generations of knitters. Losing a pattern meant losing a piece of cultural identity. The wool itself was precious. Most families raised sheep specifically for wool. In summer, you'd shear the sheep, then spend weeks cleaning the wool, washing it, picking out debris, carding it to align the fibres. Then you'd spin it into yarn using a drop spindle or spinning wheel, which was another entire skill set. Only then could you knit. This meant every sock, every mitten, every sweater represented months of work. You didn't just knit the item, you raised the sheep, sheared it, processed the wool, spun the yarn and then knitted. When you wore a sweater, you were wearing hundreds of hours of labour. Some women dyed their wool using plants foraged in summer. Lichen created beautiful browns and reds. Berries made purples. Roots and barks contributed yellows and greens. The dye process was complex, requiring mordants to set the colour, but it meant your knitting could be colourful instead of just natural sheep colours. The really skilled knitters created intricate colourwork patterns, geometric designs, snowflakes, traditional motifs. These patterns had meaning. Some were protective symbols, others represented family heritage. A sweater wasn't just warm, it was a story you wore. Men occasionally knitted too, especially sailors and fishermen who had downtime on boats. They focused on practical items, thick socks, hats, mittens. Their technique was often rougher, more utilitarian but effective. Nobody cared if it looked pretty as long as it kept you warm. Children sat with the knitting circles too, even the boys when they were young. They'd play quietly nearby or work on their own small projects, simple scarves or dishcloths, learning by proximity. The clicking needles, the songs, the stories, this was the soundtrack of childhood. During Christmas, knitting circles intensified. There were gifts to finish. Special Christmas socks with red yarn if you could afford it. New sweaters for family members. Everything had to be ready before Christmas Eve. The pressure was real. Women would knit late into the night, squinting by candlelight, racing to finish projects, fingers cramped, eyes strained. But you kept going because giving someone a half-finished sock for Christmas was unacceptable. When you finally finished a major project, a full sweater, an intricate blanket, there was genuine pride. You'd show it to the knitting circle. Everyone would examine it, compliment the stitchwork, admire the pattern. This was your creation. You made this from literal sheep hair and skill. That's incredible. The knitting circles were also therapy. In a world with no counsellors, no support groups, no mental health services, women processed their struggles through these gatherings. You'd talk about your fears, your grief, your frustrations. Others would listen, offer advice, share their own experiences. The knitting provided something for your hands to do while your heart worked through difficult things. It was community care disguised as productivity. And on the darkest nights, when the polar darkness felt suffocating and cabin fever threatened everyone's sanity, the knitting circles were a lifeline. You had somewhere to go, something to do, people to see. The needles clicked, the fire crackled, the stories flowed, and slowly, stitch by stitch, you created warmth for the people you loved. That was knitting in the Arctic. Essential, social, beautiful, and absolutely non-negotiable. The most important church service of Christmas was midnight mass. Except when every hour looks like midnight, midnight becomes philosophical. churches filled with villagers holding candles, their collective light pushing back the dark for a few sacred hours. It was beautiful. It was freezing. It was the highlight of the season. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve was the single most important event of the entire year. More important than Easter. More important than any other holy day. This was the night when heaven touched earth, when light entered darkness, when hope became tangible. In a place where darkness was literal and overwhelming, the symbolism hit different. Preparation started hours before the service. Families lit every candle they owned, and I mean every single one. Candles that had been carefully rationed for weeks were now brought out without reservation. This was the one night where you didn't hold back. The church needed to blaze with light. It needed to prove that darkness could be defeated, even temporarily. People dressed in their absolute best. The clothes they'd been saving all year, the sweater with no holes, the clean socks, the shirt that wasn't stained. Women wore their nicest shawls, often family heirlooms passed down through generations. Men combed their beards and hair, looking as presentable as possible, given that bathing in Arctic winter was a traumatic event you undertook maybe twice a season. Children were scrubbed as clean as possible with cold water and strong soap, then bundled into their new Christmas clothes, the ones they'd received earlier that day. They were told in no uncertain terms to behave, to be quiet, to sit still, because this was sacred and important, and if you embarrassed the family at midnight mass, you'd hear about it for the rest of your life. The walk to church was different on Christmas Eve. More people were travelling than usual. You'd see other lights moving through the darkness. Lanterns and torches from other families making the same pilgrimage. Sometimes groups would converge on the path, joining together, their lights merging into a larger constellation moving toward the church. It felt like a procession, like something ancient and powerful, like you were part of a river of light flowing through the void. When you arrived at the church, it was already glowing. Candles in every window, candles along the path, candles held by people already inside. The wooden building looked like it was made of the light itself, a beacon in the absolute darkness of the polar night. Inside, it was packed. Everyone came to midnight mass. Everyone. The devout, the sceptical, the old, the young, the sick, who could barely walk but came anyway. You squeezed onto the benches, shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours, packed so tightly that body heat actually made the space warmer than usual. Which was still freezing, but less freezing. Each person held a candle, small ones, held carefully so the wax wouldn't drip on your clothes. The collective light from dozens, sometimes hundreds of candles created an otherworldly glow. The wooden beams overhead flickered with shadow and light. The walls seemed to breathe. The church felt alive. The service began with hymns. Everyone stood, candles held high, and sang. The acoustics in the wooden church were perfect. Voices blended and echoed, creating harmonies that sounded angelic. For people who'd been living in darkness and isolation, who'd been cold and tired and struggling, this moment of collective singing felt transcendent. You weren't just singing, you were declaring. You were fighting back against the darkness with sound and light and faith. Every voice mattered. Every note pushed back the void just a little further. The priest entered in his finest vestments, probably still worn and patched, because this was a rural Arctic church, not the Vatican, but they were ceremonial and special. He blessed the congregation, his voice solemn and reverent. Then came the Christmas story, the Nativity, told in Latin first, then translated into the local language. Everyone knew it by heart, but hearing it again on this night, in this place, it felt new. A baby born in the darkest time of year, a light entering the world when the world needed it most. The metaphor wasn't subtle, and it didn't need to be. The priest spoke about hope, about endurance, about how darkness never lasts forever, even when it feels permanent, about how light always returns, even after the longest night. These weren't just religious platitudes, they were survival instructions. They were promises that you desperately needed to believe. Communion was offered. People filed forward slowly, reverently, receiving the bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ shared in the frozen darkness. It was intimate, it was communal, it was a reminder that you weren't alone. More hymns followed. Silent night. if the church was influenced by German traditions, though in Arctic Norway it was probably Deilige Jorden or other local hymns. The melodies were haunting, minor key, beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. Children started falling asleep on their parents' laps. Adults swayed slightly, exhausted from the week's preparations but sustained by the atmosphere. The service stretched on, longer than usual, because this was Christmas, and you didn't rush Christmas. Finally, the blessing. The priest raised his hands and blessed everyone present. He prayed for health, for safety, for successful harvests come spring, for protection from darkness, both literal and spiritual. He reminded everyone that Christ's light lived in them, that they carried that light out into the world. And then, the most powerful moment, the recessional. Everyone filed out of the church slowly, candles still lit, walking back into the darkness. But this time, the darkness felt different, less oppressive, less permanent, because you carried light with you. Dozens of tiny flames moving through the void, refusing to be extinguished. Some families sang as they walked home, others walked in contemplative silence. Either way, there was peace. A bone-deep calm that came from having participated in something holy and communal and ancient. When you finally arrived home, you carefully extinguished your candle but saved the stub. Some families kept their Christmas Eve candle and lit it again on difficult nights throughout the year, believing it carried special blessing. Others saved the wax to mix into new candles. The house felt different after midnight mass. Warmer, somehow, even though the temperature hadn't changed. Lighter, even though it was still dark outside. You'd go to bed knowing that Christmas had officially arrived, that you'd honoured it properly, that you'd done everything right, and you'd sleep deeply, peacefully, with the memory of candlelight and hymns echoing in your mind. Because midnight mass in the polar night wasn't just a church service. It was proof that humans could create light in any darkness. It was a reminder that hope wasn't optional, it was necessary. It was the moment when an entire community came together and said, "We're still here, we're still fighting, we're still believing." And somehow that was enough. Icelanders and Norwegians believed in hidden people, elves or spirits who lived in rocks and hills. During Christmas, you left offerings of food to keep them happy. You didn't move certain stones. You didn't insult the landscape. Because if you angered the hidden people, your crops would fail. Or worse, they'd steal your baby and replace it with a changeling. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't quaint superstition that people winked about. This was genuine, deeply held belief that shaped daily life and decision-making. The hidden people, called huldufolk in Icelandic or de underjordiske in Norwegian, were as real as your neighbours. More real, actually, because your neighbours were visible and therefore less mysterious. The hidden people looked like humans, mostly. They lived in parallel communities inside rocks, hills and cliffs. They had families, jobs, livestock and social structures just like humans. The main difference? They were invisible to most people, most of the time. Only certain individuals, usually children or people with the sight, could see them clearly. But just because you couldn't see them didn't mean they couldn't see you. They were always watching, always aware, always judging your behaviour. Certain rocks and formations were known to be hidden people dwellings. Everyone in the community knew which ones. There was the large boulder at the edge of Olaf's field. Hidden people lived there. Everyone knew it. You didn't lean against that rock. You didn't urinate near it. You definitely didn't try to move it or break it apart for building materials. Farmers would literally plough around these rocks, leaving them standing in the middle of otherwise cleared fields. Modern people looking at old Arctic farms would wonder, why is there a random boulder in the middle of this field? The answer, hidden people. Moving it would be disastrous. There were documented cases, recent cases, even into the 20th century, of construction projects in Iceland being rerouted because the planned route went through known hidden people territory. Roads were moved, buildings were relocated, because the alternative was inviting catastrophe. What kind of catastrophe? Glad you asked. If you angered the hidden people, your life would fall apart. Livestock would sicken and die, crops would fail, tools would break. You'd have accidents, falling, injuring yourself, inexplicably bad luck that followed you everywhere. Your milk would sour, Your bread wouldn't rise, your children would get sick, and the worst possibility, they'd take your child. Changelings were a real fear. The hidden people would allegedly steal a human baby and replace it with one of their own. The changeling would look similar but would act wrong, constantly crying, never growing properly, never learning to speak. It would drain the family's resources and cause endless heartache. Parents were vigilant. You never left a baby alone before it was baptized. You put iron near the cradle. Hidden people supposedly hated iron. You made the sign of the cross over the child. You kept watch during the vulnerable period between birth and baptism, because that's when changelings happened. Some stories told of mothers who suspected their child was a changeling and performed tests. Cruel tests by modern standards, like threatening the child or exposing it to danger to see if the hidden people would reclaim it and return the real child. These weren't monster parents. These were desperate people living in genuine fear, operating on beliefs that everyone in their community shared and validated. During Christmas, the relationship with hidden people became even more important. Christmas was a liminal time, a thin period when the boundary between worlds weakened. The hidden people were more active, more visible, more likely to interact with humans, so you left offerings. On Christmas Eve, before your own feast, you'd prepare a small plate of your best food. Some families placed it outside near a known hidden people dwelling, that special rock, a particular hill. Others left it in a specific spot in the house, believing hidden people might enter during the night. The offering usually included porridge with butter, bread, dried fish, maybe some Christmas beer. Not your leftovers, your good stuff. You didn't insult the hidden people with scraps. That would backfire spectacularly. In the morning the food would be gone. Had the hidden people taken it? Had animals eaten it? Did it matter? The point was the gesture. You'd shown respect. You'd acknowledged their existence and their claim to the land you shared. Some families cleaned their houses extra thoroughly before Christmas, not just for themselves but for the hidden people who might visit. You swept, organised, made everything presentable, because hidden people judged your housekeeping apparently, and if they found your home dirty, they'd curse you. The hidden people had their own Christmas celebrations happening simultaneously with human celebrations. Sometimes people claimed to hear music and laughter coming from hills and rocks on Christmas Eve. The hidden people's feast echoing into the human world. If you heard it, you didn't investigate. You didn't interrupt. You just nodded, acknowledged it, and went about your business. Icelandic tradition held that on New Year's Eve, the hidden people moved to new homes, just like some humans did. On that night you'd see lights moving across the landscape, the hidden people transporting their belongings. You left your doors and windows open briefly to allow them passage through your property if needed. Blocking their path was asking for trouble. Children were taught these beliefs from birth. You learned which rocks to respect, which places to avoid, how to behave around potential hidden people territory. You learned to say, "Excuse me," when walking through certain areas. You learned to be polite, always, because you never knew who or what was listening. Skeptics existed even then, but they kept their skepticism quiet. Because even if you didn't fully believe, why risk it? What did it cost you to leave a plate of porridge out on Christmas Eve? What did it cost to avoid moving that rock? Nothing. But the potential cost of angering the hidden people was everything. This was Pascal's wager applied to folklore. Better to believe and be wrong than to disbelieve and suffer consequences. And here's the thing. People had evidence. Everyone knew someone whose cousin's friend had seen hidden people. Everyone knew a family who'd moved a rock and then suffered terrible luck until they put it back and apologised. Everyone knew a child who'd been stolen and replaced. Or so the story went. The stories reinforced the belief. The belief shaped behaviour. The behaviour became culture. And in the harsh Arctic environment, where life was precarious and death was always close, you didn't take chances. You respected the land. You respected its invisible inhabitants. You left offerings. You followed the rules, because the hidden people weren't just superstition. They were the personification of respect for nature, for mystery, for the things you couldn't control or understand. And in the darkness of the polar night, when the world felt hostile and strange, believing in hidden people meant believing you weren't alone, even if your companions were invisible and potentially dangerous. it was still better than facing the darkness with nothing but your own fragile mortality. So you left the porridge, and you didn't move the rock, and you hoped that was enough. Christmas wasn't one day. It was 12 days of feasting, resting, and trying not to go insane from lack of sunlight. Work was forbidden. Everyone stayed indoors, ate leftovers, drank aquavit, and waited for the sun to even think about coming back. Cabin fever was real. Family tensions were high, but you survived. The 12 days of Christmas ran from December 25th through January 5th, ending on Twelfth Night. During this entire period, normal work stopped. Completely. You didn't fish. You didn't farm. Not that there was farming to do in frozen ground, but still. You didn't do heavy chores. You didn't travel for business. You didn't conduct any transactions. This was sacred time. Rest time. Family time. And also, let's be honest, slowly losing your mind because you were trapped indoors with the same people in perpetual darkness time. The first few days were great. You had Christmas energy. The house smelled like food. You had leftovers from the feast, dried fish, porridge, bread, maybe some meat if you were lucky. You'd sit around the fire, tell stories, play simple games, sing songs. Children played with their new toys. Adults relaxed for the first time in months. It felt like vacation. Like you'd earned this rest after a brutal year of work. You could just exist. No pressure, no obligations, just warmth, food, and family. By day 3 or 4, the novelty was wearing off. You'd told all your best stories. You'd sung all the songs you knew. The leftovers were getting repetitive. The children were getting restless. The cabin, which had felt cosy, now felt small. Very small. Claustrophobically small. You'd look around and realise these are the same 4 walls you've been staring at for months. These are the same faces you see every single day, and you're going to keep seeing them in this same space for 8 more days, at least. The darkness didn't help. Without the sun to mark time, the days blurred together. Was it day 5? Day 6? Did it matter? Time became meaningless. You ate when you were hungry. You slept when you were tired. The structure of a normal life dissolved into a shapeless routine of eating, sleeping, and existing. Family tensions emerged. Little things became big things. Your brother chewed too loudly. Your sister hummed that same tune constantly, and it was driving you insane. Your mother kept rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. Your father told the same 3 stories on repeat. Arguments broke out, usually over nothing. Someone took the best seat by the fire. Someone ate the last piece of good bread. Someone made a comment that was interpreted as an insult. Suddenly everyone was mad, and in a small cabin with nowhere to go, that anger just sat there, festering. This was cabin fever in its purest form. Isolation plus confinement plus darkness equals psychological pressure. People snapped at each other. Tempers flared. You'd storm off to the other side of the room all 10 feet away and sulk. But here's the thing. You couldn't stay mad. You were stuck together. You needed each other. So eventually someone would apologise, or everyone would just pretend the argument never happened and move on. Because what choice did you have? Some families handled it better than others. Those with more space, wealthier families with larger homes, could separate into different rooms when tensions ran high. Poorer families in one-room cabins had no such luxury. You were all there, all the time, whether you wanted to be or not. Activities helped. Women continued knitting. Always knitting, because the work never truly stopped. Men carved wood or repaired tools. Children played games, simple ones like hiding objects and finding them, or making up stories with their toys. Card games were popular if the family owned cards, which was rare. Dice games worked too. Anything to pass the time and provide distraction from the darkness outside and the growing tension inside. Visiting neighbours helped break the monotony. If the weather allowed, and that was a big if, families would bundle up and make the trek to visit friends. You'd spend a day at someone else's house, which provided new conversation, new stories, new faces. Then they'd visit you. This rotation of social calls kept everyone sane. Food was rationed carefully. The Christmas feast was over, but you had to make the supplies last through all 12 days. You couldn't just eat everything on day 2 and then have nothing for the remaining 10 days. So portions got smaller, meals got simpler. By day 10, you were eating the scraps, the burnt edges, the stuff you'd normally feed to the animals. aquavit consumption increased steadily throughout the 12 days. Day 1, a few shots, ceremonial. Day 7, drinking more regularly because it was something to do and it made the cabin feel warmer and your family more tolerable. Day 12, you'd gone through more aquavit than you'd planned, and now you were rationing that too. The nights were the hardest. Without work to tire you out, you weren't as exhausted as usual. You'd lie in bed staring at the darkness, inside and outside, unable to sleep. Your mind would wander. You'd think about everything and nothing. You'd question your life choices. Why do we live here? Why don't we move somewhere with actual sunlight? Could we survive a move? Would anywhere else even take us? But morning would come, or what passed for morning, and you'd get up and do it all again. Some families had traditions to mark different days. On 12th night, you'd have one final feast, using up whatever special food remained. You'd light extra candles. You'd sing one last round of Christmas songs. It was bittersweet. Christmas was ending, which meant work would resume, but also it meant this forced togetherness would end. Children were always disappointed when the 12 days ended. They wanted the holiday to continue forever. Adults felt differently. They were ready to get back to normal life, to have structure again, to do something other than sit around and exist. But everyone acknowledged what they'd accomplished. 12 days together. 12 days of rest in the middle of brutal winter. 12 days of maintaining peace, mostly in conditions that would break most modern people after 3 days. You survived the 12 days of Christmas not by loving every minute, but by enduring, by forgiving, by adapting, by finding small joys in repetitive days. By morning of January 6th, when normal work resumed, you'd feel relief. The holiday was over, life could continue, but deep down, secretly, you'd already be looking forward to next Christmas. Because despite the cabin fever, despite the tensions, despite the darkness, the 12 days were proof that rest was possible, that family mattered, and that humans could create warmth and meaning even in the coldest, darkest circumstances. And honestly, that was worth celebrating, even if it nearly drove you insane. On New Year's Eve, villagers built massive bonfires. Not for warmth, for psychological warfare against trolls. The bigger the fire, the safer you were. People danced, sang, and threw old items into the flames to symbolize letting go of the past year. It was cleansing. It was dramatic. It worked, because no one ever saw a troll, or admitted it. New Year's Eve in the Arctic wasn't about champagne and countdown clocks. It was about fire. Massive, roaring, troll-terrifying fire. Preparations started days in advance. The entire community worked together to gather wood. Every scrap of burnable material they could find. Dead trees, old fence posts, broken furniture, anything that would burn. They'd haul it to the centre of the village, stacking it into an enormous pile that grew taller each day. This wasn't a modest campfire, this was a statement, a declaration. A middle finger to the darkness and everything that lurked in it. The woodpile would reach 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet high. A wooden mountain waiting to explode into flame. The reasoning was simple. Trolls hated fire. They hated light. They hated anything that pushed back against the darkness they thrived in. So on New Year's Eve, the threshold between the old year and the new, a vulnerable moment when supernatural forces were strongest, you built the biggest fire imaginable to keep them away. As evening approached, or what passed for evening since it was always dark, families began gathering in the village centre. Everyone came. This wasn't optional. Missing the New Year's bonfire was both socially unacceptable and potentially dangerous. You needed the fire's protection. You needed the community's collective energy. People dressed warmly but brought their worst clothing. Old shirts with holes, worn-out shoes, broken tools they'd been meaning to throw away. These would become offerings to the fire. When everyone was assembled, the village elder or designated firelighter would approach the woodpile with a torch. Sometimes this honour went to the oldest person in the village, sometimes to someone who'd had particular success that year. Either way, it was ceremonial. The torch touched the wood. The fire caught immediately. People had prepared well, placing kindling at the base. Within minutes, flames were climbing the pile. Within 10 minutes, the bonfire was roaring, shooting flames 30 feet into the air, creating a column of light and heat that pushed back the darkness like nothing else could. The heat was intense. Even standing 20 feet away, your face felt like it was burning. But no one backed away. This was the point. The fire needed to be massive, overwhelming, a beacon that said, "We are here, we are strong, try us." The fire illuminated the entire village. Buildings that had been invisible in the darkness suddenly had shape and definition. Faces that had looked ghostly in candlelight now glowed warm and orange. For the first time in months, you could see clearly. Really see. Your neighbours, your friends, your family. It was like the sun had returned just for one night. And then the celebration began. People threw their old belongings into the fire, a worn-out shoe, a broken chair, scraps of fabric too damaged to repair. Each item represented something from the past year you were ready to release. Your failures, your grief, your mistakes. You'd hurl them into the flames and watch them burn, symbolically destroying the old to make space for the new. Some people wrote down their regrets on pieces of bark or wood, then threw those in too. Illiterate folks just spoke their regrets aloud before tossing in a symbolic object. The fire consumed everything. It was cathartic. It was therapy. It was a fresh start made literal. Then came the dancing. Not formal, choreographed dancing. Wild, celebratory, slightly drunk dancing. People linked arms and circled the fire, singing folk songs and working songs and made-up songs. The circle moved clockwise, counterclockwise, faster, slower, whatever felt right. Children ran around the outside of the circle, shrieking with joy and adrenaline. Aquavit flowed freely. Bottles passed from person to person. You'd take a drink, pass it on, watch someone else take a drink. By the third rotation, everyone was warm, both from the fire and from the alcohol. Inhibitions dropped. Laughter came easier. Even people who'd been feuding all year would end up arm in arm around the fire, temporarily united by the spectacle. The elders told stories about previous New Year's fires. The year the fire was so big it melted the snow in a 100-foot radius. The year drunk old tried to jump over the flames and singed his beard off. The year everyone swore they saw a troll at the edge of the firelight, watching with glowing eyes before fleeing. That last story always got attention, because everyone knew trolls were watching. The fire was specifically to keep them at bay, and it worked. No trolls attacked during the bonfire. No one was dragged off into the darkness. The fire's protection held. Children were told that the louder they sang, the further the trolls would stay away. So they sang at maximum volume, screaming, singing into the night, their voices hoarse but determined. Adults joined in, creating a wall of sound that accompanied the wall of light. The fire burned for hours. As it died down, people threw on more wood. Broken tools, old baskets, anything to keep it going. You wanted the fire to last until midnight, that symbolic threshold when the old year ended and the new began. At the moment of transition, determined by someone's clock or just collective agreement, everyone would cheer, embrace, wish each other health and prosperity for the coming year. Some villages rang church bells if they had them. Others just shouted into the darkness, claiming the new year with their voices. The fire would continue burning even after midnight, gradually shrinking from a bonfire to a large fire to eventually just embers. People would stay as long as they could stand the cold, reluctant to leave the warmth and light and community. When you finally went home, walking through the darkness back to your cabin, you'd look back and see the fire still glowing in the distance. A warm spot in the cold, a light in the void, proof that humans could create something powerful enough to hold back the night, at least temporarily, and you'd go to bed feeling protected. The trolls had been warned. The old year had been burned away. The new year stretched ahead, full of possibility. The bonfire had done its job. The trolls stayed in the mountains, and honestly, whether that was because the fire actually scared them, or because trolls were never real in the first place, didn't matter. What mattered was the community had gathered. The darkness had been pushed back. The fears had been named and symbolically destroyed. And that was enough to face another year in the Arctic darkness. That was more than enough. By early January, people began watching the horizon. Obsessively. Would the sun return? Logically, yes. Emotionally, who could say? When the first sliver of sun appeared, just a golden edge, villages erupted. People cried, they cheered, they ran outside just to feel light on their faces. The sun had come back. Christmas was over. Life could resume. The waiting was excruciating. You knew the sun would return. Your grandparents had told you it would. The calendar said it would. Logic, science, observable patterns, all pointed to the sun's eventual return. But after 2 months of complete darkness, logic started to feel like a rumour, a story someone told you that might or might not be true. Because right now, in this moment, there was no sun. There had never been sun. Maybe sun was a collective delusion. Maybe you dreamed the whole thing. This was the psychological breaking point for many people. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't a diagnosis yet, but it was absolutely real. People became depressed, lethargic, hopeless. Some stopped eating properly, others slept too much or couldn't sleep at all. The darkness did things to your brain that you couldn't articulate but could definitely feel. Children who'd been born during the polar night had never seen the sun. They'd heard about it, but they had no reference point. Parents would describe it, a bright light in the sky that makes everything warm and golden. Children would nod, not really understanding, thinking their parents were describing something mythical, like dragons or trolls. By early January, when astronomical calculations suggested the sun would soon crest the horizon, people started watching. They'd bundle up and stand outside, staring at the southern horizon, waiting for the first sign. The first few days were disappointing. Nothing. Just the same darkness, the same stars, the same empty horizon. People would go inside, cold and discouraged, wondering if they'd miscalculated. But then one day, someone would notice something. A faint lightening of the sky along the southern horizon. Not bright, not even really light, just less dark. A subtle gradient from pitch black to dark grey to slightly lighter grey. Word would spread immediately. There's light on the horizon. People would rush outside to look. Was it real? Was it just wishful thinking? Everyone would stare, debating, pointing, trying to convince themselves they weren't imagining it. Over the next few days, the pre-dawn glow would grow stronger. Each day, the lightning would last a little longer, reach a little higher in the sky. The anticipation became almost unbearable. It was coming. The sun was actually coming back. Villages had traditions for the sun's return. Some rang church bells. Others prepared special foods. Everyone, regardless of tradition, watched the horizon with religious intensity. And then finally it happened. The day, the moment, the actual literal return of the sun. It started as a hint of gold at the horizon's edge. Just the tiniest sliver, barely visible, but it was there. Definitely there. Real, tangible sunlight touching the world for the first time in months. People lost their minds. They cheered. They cried. They hugged complete strangers. Children jumped up and down, screaming with excitement, even though they weren't entirely sure what they were excited about. Adults stood with tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by emotion they couldn't quite name. The sun didn't rise fully. Not at first. That first day it just peaked above the horizon. A golden edge, like it was testing whether it was safe to come back. Then it disappeared again. But it had been there. Everyone had seen it. The sun existed. The world made sense again. Over the following days the sun would rise a little higher, stay a little longer. Each day brought more light. The progress was incremental but undeniable. 5 minutes of visible sun became 10 minutes, became 30 minutes, became an hour. People did irrational things during these first days of sunlight. They'd drop everything, chores, meals, conversations, and run outside when the sun appeared, just to stand in its light. They'd close their eyes and tilt their faces upward, feeling warmth on their skin for the first time in months. Some people cried every time. It didn't get less emotional. Every appearance felt like a miracle. The light itself looked different than you remembered. Brighter, more golden, more precious. You'd stare at the way it hit buildings, how it created shadows, things you hadn't seen in 2 months. You'd watch how it reflected off the snow, creating sparkles and highlights that made the frozen landscape look beautiful instead of hostile. Colours returned to the world. During the darkness, everything had been shades of grey and black, only visible by candlelight or starlight. But now, with actual sunlight, you could see blue again, red, green. The world had dimension and depth and colour, and it was stunning. Children seeing the sun for the first time were confused and delighted. They'd squint, cover their eyes, not used to brightness. Parents would explain, "This is the sun. This is what we've been waiting for." The children would stare, mesmerised, trying to understand this new phenomenon that made the whole world visible. The return of the sun marked the unofficial end of the Christmas season, even though some traditions extended a few more weeks. But psychologically, the sun's return meant winter's grip was loosening. Spring would come eventually. Life would resume. You'd survive the darkest part. Communities celebrated with gatherings, feasts, church services. Priests gave sermons about light overcoming darkness, which hit different when you'd literally been living in darkness for 2 months. The religious metaphors weren't subtle, but they didn't need to be. They were true in a visceral, experienced way. People's moods improved immediately and dramatically. The depression lifted, energy returned, conversations became more animated, laughter came easier. It was like the entire population had been given antidepressants made of photons. Work resumed with renewed purpose. You could see what you were doing now. You could work outside without carrying a lantern. Simple tasks became easier, more efficient, more pleasant. But there was also a bittersweet quality to the sun's return. Christmas, the long, dark, intense period of community and rest, was officially over. The special time had ended. Normal life, with all its demands and struggles, was back. Some people felt relief. Others felt a strange nostalgia, already missing the closeness of the dark season even though they'd been desperate to escape it. Either way, the sun's return was proof. Proof that the world kept turning. Proof that darkness never lasted forever. Proof that patience and endurance were rewarded. You'd survived the polar night. You'd celebrated Christmas in total darkness. You'd maintained your humanity, your faith, your community, your sanity, mostly, through the hardest season imaginable. And now the sun was back. Golden, warm, beautiful, life-giving sun. You'd stand outside in its light, feeling its warmth on your face, and think, we did it. We made it through. And you'd know, with absolute certainty, that you could do it again. Because the sun always came back. Always. Even when it felt impossible. That was the promise. That was the hope. That was Christmas in the darkness. Light always returns. Always. Living in 24-hour darkness wasn't just inconvenient. It messed with your brain. Seasonal depression was rampant. People slept irregularly, felt lethargic, and experienced something we now call seasonal affective disorder. They didn't have therapy or light boxes. They had community, fire, and the stubborn belief that spring would come. Somehow that was enough. Let's be clear about what was happening physiologically. Your brain relies on sunlight to regulate circadian rhythms, produce serotonin and maintain melatonin balance. When the sun disappears for 2 months, all of that goes haywire. Your body loses track of when to be awake and when to sleep. Your mood-regulating neurotransmitters tank. Your brain essentially short-circuits. Modern science calls this seasonal affective disorder, or CED, which is an unfortunately accurate acronym. The symptoms include depression, lethargy, appetite changes, social withdrawal, and a general sense that everything is pointless and will never get better. Now imagine experiencing all of that without understanding why, without medication, without therapy, without even a vocabulary to describe what's wrong. You just felt bad, constantly, and you couldn't explain it. People slept weird hours. Some would sleep 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Their bodies confused by the constant darkness and just giving up. Others developed insomnia, lying awake for hours in the dark, their minds racing with anxious thoughts they couldn't shut off. The lack of routine made it worse. Without the sun to structure your day, everything became optional. Why get up? Why get dressed? Why do anything? The darkness outside matched the darkness you felt inside, and the boundary between the two blurred. Some people stopped bathing. Not out of laziness, but because bathing in Arctic winter was miserable. Heating water, stripping down in the cold, the whole ordeal. And when you're depressed, even basic self-care feels impossible. So you just didn't. You wore the same clothes for weeks. You stopped combing your hair. You stopped caring. Appetite changed drastically. Some people ate constantly. Their bodies craving calories to stay warm and carbohydrates to boost serotonin. Others lost their appetite entirely, finding food tasteless and eating only because someone forced them to. Social withdrawal was common. You'd sit in the corner, not talking, not participating, just staring at the fire or into the darkness. Your family would try to engage you, tell us a story, come sing with us, and you'd shake your head, unable to summon the energy or interest. Some people cried for no reason, just sudden, overwhelming sadness that hit like a wave. You'd be sitting there, doing nothing, and tears would start flowing. You couldn't explain why. You weren't thinking about anything sad. You just felt profoundly, inexplicably sad. Others felt numb. Not sad, not happy, just nothing. Emotional flatness. Going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. This was sometimes worse than sadness, because at least sadness was something. Numbness was a void. Irritability spiked. Small annoyances became enraging. Your spouse chewing. Your child asking questions. The sound of the fire crackling. Everything grated on your nerves. You'd snap at people over nothing, then feel guilty, which made you feel worse, which made you more irritable. A vicious cycle. Hopelessness was the most dangerous symptom. The feeling that the darkness would never end, that the sun was gone forever, that life would always be this hard, this cold, this dark. Logically, you knew better. But logic didn't live in the same part of the brain that was currently drowning in despair. Some people talked about ending it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet mentions. Maybe I'll just walk out into the snow and not come back. Maybe I'll fall asleep by the fire and not wake up. These weren't necessarily serious suicide threats. They were expressions of exhaustion. But they were concerning enough that families kept close watch on members who seemed particularly low. There were deaths sometimes, usually framed as accidents. He went out to check on the animals and didn't come back. She wandered off during a storm, but the community understood. The darkness took people, not through trolls or starvation, but through despair so profound that walking into a blizzard felt like relief. But most people survived. How? Community, forced social interaction. Even when you didn't want to see anyone, your family made you participate, made you eat, made you knit or carve or do something productive, made you attend church, made you visit neighbours. They didn't let you sink into isolation because isolation killed. Fire, literal and metaphorical. The physical warmth of the fire, yes, but also the gathering around it, the shared space, the ritual of tending it together. Fire was activity. Fire was purpose. Fire was light, routine. Even without the sun, families created structure. Meals at consistent times, prayer at consistent times, work during what they decided was day, rest during what they called night. The structure was arbitrary but necessary. It gave shape to shapeless time, stories and songs, distraction, entertainment. Reminding yourself that humans had endured this before and would endure it again. That you were part of a long tradition of survival. That you weren't alone in your suffering. Faith, the belief that God hadn't abandoned you, even when the sun had. That there was meaning in the suffering. That spring was promised, that light would return, that this was temporary. Faith wasn't a cure for depression, but it was a lifeline when you had nothing else to hold on to. And sheer stubbornness. The Norwegian concept of grit, a refusal to give up even when giving up seemed rational. Your ancestors survived this. You would too. Complaining was fine. Crying was fine. But quitting, unacceptable. Some people found odd sources of comfort. The predictability of the darkness, ironically, could be soothing. It never changed. You knew exactly what to expect. No surprises, no demands. Just consistent, reliable darkness. Others found purpose in taking care of others. If you couldn't summon energy for yourself, maybe you could for your children. for your elderly parents, for your neighbours. Caregiving pulled you outside yourself, gave you a reason to get up. The community also normalised the struggle. Everyone was miserable, everyone was struggling. You weren't weak for feeling depressed. You were human. The shared misery created connection. "I'm struggling too" was comfort. You weren't failing. You were experiencing exactly what everyone else was experiencing. And ultimately there was hope. Not blind optimism, but evidence-based hope. The sun had left before and returned. Your grandparents survived this. The calendar promised that in X number of days the sun would return. You could count down. You could see progress, even if you couldn't see the sun yet. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't medication, but it worked. Most people made it through. Most people survived the polar night with their sanity mostly intact. They carried scars, they carried trauma, but they carried on. Because what else could you do? The darkness didn't care about your feelings. The cold didn't pause for your mental health. You either adapted and survived, or you didn't. And humans, it turns out, are remarkably good at adapting. Even when adaptation means just barely holding on. Even when survival looks like getting through one dark day at a time, that was enough. It had to be. Here's the real question. Why didn't everyone just leave? Because this was home. These people were born into the dark, raised in the cold, and built lives around the rhythm of an extreme environment. They adapted, they celebrated, they survived. And every Christmas in total darkness was proof that humans are far more resilient and stubborn than we give ourselves credit for. From an outside perspective, it seems insane. Why would anyone choose to live somewhere the sun disappears for 2 months? Somewhere frostbite is a daily threat? Somewhere trolls are a legitimate concern? Somewhere your Christmas dinner is dried fish soaked in drain cleaner? The simple answer, they didn't choose. They were born there. Their parents were born there. Their grandparents were born there. This wasn't a lifestyle decision. It was inheritance. But the deeper answer is more complicated and more beautiful. This was home. Not home in the abstract sense, but home in the bone-deep, non-negotiable sense. They knew every rock, every hill, every frozen stream. They knew which boulder housed hidden people. They knew where the best fishing spots were. They knew the landscape in a way that went beyond maps or directions. They knew it in their bodies, in their memories, in their souls. Their ancestors were buried here. In the literal ground, marked by stones or crosses or just memory. Leaving meant abandoning them. It meant breaking a chain of connection that stretched back centuries. It meant saying your family's history didn't matter. And for people who lived in oral tradition, who carried stories as their only inheritance, that was unthinkable. The community was irreplaceable. Everyone knew everyone. Your neighbours weren't just neighbours. They were the people who'd pulled you out of a blizzard, who'd lent you food when you ran short, who'd midwifed your children, who'd sat with your dying mother. You owed them. They owed you. Moving away meant severing bonds that were stronger than blood, and practically speaking, where would they go? Moving in the 1800s wasn't like booking a flight and renting an apartment. It meant selling everything, packing what you could carry, travelling for weeks or months through dangerous terrain, and arriving somewhere you knew nothing about with no guarantee of welcome or survival. The South, where the sun actually behaved normally, was foreign. Different laws, different customs, different economy. You'd be an outsider, a northerner, probably poor, definitely uneducated by southern standards, speaking with an accent that marked you as backward. You'd face discrimination and struggle to find work. You'd be trading familiar hardship for unfamiliar hardship, and at least here you knew how to survive. Plus, the North had advantages people rarely talk about. The midnight sun in summer. Yes, winter was brutal, but summer was glorious. Endless daylight, long, growing seasons for hardy crops, fishing opportunities, a landscape that exploded into green and wildflowers. The extreme seasons created a rhythm. You endured winter by remembering summer. You worked through summer preparing for winter. The resources were real. Fish were abundant. Hunting and trapping provided income. Furs sold well in the south. The sea and the land provided if you knew how to work with them. People weren't wealthy, but they survived. They had enough. And enough was more than many people in the overcrowded south had. There was also pride. Surviving the Arctic winter was an accomplishment. It made you tough, resourceful, resilient. Northerners looked at soft Southerners who'd never experienced real cold and felt a quiet superiority. We survive things you can't imagine. That identity mattered. That pride mattered. And there was beauty. Real, stunning beauty. The northern lights dancing across the sky. The way starlight reflected off snow, creating a silver landscape that looked like another world. The silence. Deep, profound silence you never found in cities. The way the first sunrise after polar night made you cry with relief and joy. These people didn't hate their home. They loved it. Complicated, difficult, challenging love, but love nonetheless. The kind of love that includes frustration and hardship, but remains love. They developed skills specific to this environment that wouldn't translate elsewhere. They knew how to navigate by stars. How to survive blizzards, how to read snow conditions, how to preserve food for months, how to maintain hope in darkness. These skills were valuable here and worthless in the South. Children raised in this environment developed differently. They were tough in ways Southern children weren't. They understood hardship. They understood community. They understood that survival required cooperation, preparation, and grit. Parents wanted to pass those values to the next generation. Religion played a role too. Many believed God had placed them here for a reason, that their suffering had meaning, that enduring the polar night was a kind of test or purification. Leaving felt like giving up on God's plan, like admitting defeat. And honestly, some people thrived in the extreme. They liked the challenge. They liked knowing that every day required skill and effort to survive. They liked being pushed to their limits and discovering they could endure. The harshness wasn't a bug. It was a feature. There was also inertia. Moving required energy, planning, resources, and hope that things would be better elsewhere. When you're exhausted from just surviving, when you're depressed from the darkness, when you're barely getting by, you don't have capacity for major life changes, so you stay, not because it's ideal, but because leaving feels impossible. But most fundamentally, people stayed because humans adapt incredibly well. Give humans any environment, desert, jungle, tundra, mountain, and they'll figure out how to survive. They'll create culture. They'll find joy. They'll build communities. They'll make it work. The Arctic wasn't uniquely terrible. It was uniquely challenging. But humans rose to the challenge. They created Christmas traditions that turned darkness into something sacred. They built social structures that prevented isolation from killing people. They developed technologies, clothing, architecture, food preservation that made survival possible. They told stories that gave meaning to suffering. They didn't just survive, they lived, they laughed, they loved, they celebrated. They found beauty in their harsh world and created more beauty through their culture. Every Christmas in total darkness was proof. Proof that humans don't just endure, they transform. They take impossible circumstances and create meaning, create joy, create connection. The people of the Arctic Circle didn't stay because they were trapped. They stayed because they were home, and home, no matter how dark or cold, is worth fighting for. That's why they stayed. That's why their descendants still live there today. That's why, centuries later, we tell their stories with awe and respect. Because they proved what humans are capable of when we refuse to give up. They proved that light isn't just something the sun provides. It's something we create, together, in the darkness, every single year. In Norway and Finland, Christmas peace was declared on Christmas Eve, a legally enforced truce where all conflicts, disputes, and bad behaviour were strictly forbidden. This wasn't a suggestion. Breaking the Christmas peace could result in serious punishment, including fines or even execution in earlier centuries. Imagine getting into an argument with your neighbour about his goat eating your fence, and the village elder threatening you with exile because you couldn't wait 3 days to be petty. The darkness was already oppressive enough without adding human drama to it. So people buttoned up their grievances, smiled through gritted teeth at relatives they couldn't stand, and saved their feuds for January like civilized folks. It was forced holiday cheer, legally mandated. Honestly, it probably saved lives. Nothing says peace on earth quite like behave or face consequences. The Christmas peace tradition dates back centuries, possibly to medieval times, and was taken incredibly seriously. In Finland, it's still announced publicly in the city of Turku every Christmas Eve at noon, a tradition that's continued unbroken for over 700 years. A representative reads the declaration from the steps of the cathedral, reminding everyone that Christmas peace is now in effect, and you'd better act accordingly. The declaration was both spiritual and legal. It combined Christian values of goodwill with the very practical recognition that forcing people to coexist peacefully during the hardest part of winter was necessary for community survival. Here's how it worked. Starting on Christmas Eve and continuing through the 12 days of Christmas, all violence, disputes, loud arguments, drunken fights, theft, and general bad behaviour were strictly prohibited. Not just discouraged, prohibited, with actual legal consequences. If you broke the Christmas peace, the punishment was severe. In medieval times, you could be executed. Yes, executed, for starting a fight during Christmas. Later, when execution was deemed a bit extreme, punishments shifted to heavy fines, public shaming, exile from the community, or physical punishment like whipping. The severity wasn't arbitrary. It reflected how important social cohesion was during Arctic winter. One violent dispute could fracture a community. One feud could lead to retaliation, which led to more retaliation, which could spiral into blood feuds that destroyed families and villages. The darkness made everything worse. Tensions were already high from cabin fever, depression, and being stuck together constantly. Without Christmas peace, the holiday season could easily become a powder keg. So the law stepped in and said, "We don't care how much you hate each other right now, you will be peaceful, by force if necessary." This created some absurd situations. You'd have neighbours who'd been feuding for months, over property lines, over livestock, over whose grandmother insulted whose grandfather, and they'd have to show up at the same Christmas church service and act civil. They'd sit on opposite sides of the church, shooting each other looks, but they'd stay quiet. Because the alternative was punishment. Family gatherings were equally tense. You'd have relatives you couldn't stand. The uncle who always drank too much, the sister-in-law who criticised everything, the cousin who'd betrayed you in business, and you'd all be crammed into the same small cabin for 12 days. But Christmas peace meant you couldn't fight. You couldn't even start an argument. You had to be civil. So people developed coping strategies, forced politeness, changing the subject whenever conversations got heated. Leaving the room when you felt yourself getting angry, drinking just enough aquavit to tolerate people, but not so much you'd start a fight and break Christmas peace. Some families created unspoken rules. Certain topics were forbidden during Christmas. Politics, money, old grievances. You talked about safe things, the weather, the food, memories from childhood, plans for spring. Anything controversial was saved for January. The Christmas peace also applied to business disputes. If someone owed you money, you couldn't demand payment during Christmas. If someone had cheated you, you couldn't confront them. All of that had to wait. Christmas was neutral ground. Everyone got a break from their obligations and conflicts. This was especially important for debtors. In a time when debt could lead to imprisonment or servitude, Christmas peace gave people breathing room. You couldn't be arrested for debt during Christmas. You couldn't have your property seized. You got 12 days of safety, of not looking over your shoulder. Children caught on to the Christmas peace quickly and exploited it mercilessly. If you couldn't be punished severely during Christmas, this was the time to test boundaries. Kids would misbehave knowing their parents' hands were somewhat tied. Parents would respond with looks of murderous rage but would restrain themselves, mentally noting, "We'll deal with this on January 6th. The church reinforced Christmas peace through sermons. Priests would remind congregations that God was watching, that Christ came to bring peace, that harbouring anger and resentment during Christmas was sinful. The religious guilt was thick. Breaking Christmas peace wasn't just illegal, it was spiritually dangerous. You were risking your soul and your standing in the community. Village elders and local authorities took enforcement seriously. If someone violated Christmas peace, started a fight, made threats, stole something, the community would intervene immediately. The perpetrator would be restrained, possibly confined, and definitely facing consequences once Christmas ended. But the punishment wasn't just legal, it was social. Breaking Christmas peace marked you as someone who couldn't control themselves, someone who valued their petty grievances over community well-being, someone who couldn't be trusted. That reputation stuck. you'd be gossiped about for years. Remember when Olaf broke Christmas peace over a goat? What an embarrassment. The brilliance of Christmas peace was that it worked. It actually reduced violence and conflict during the most stressful time of year. By forcing people to pause their feuds, it gave them time to cool down. Often, by the time Christmas ended, the original dispute didn't seem as important. People had perspective. They'd survived another Christmas together. Maybe the feud wasn't worth continuing, and when feuds did resume in January, they were usually less intense. The forced break had taken the edge off. People fought about the same things, but with less murderous rage. Christmas peace also created a shared cultural experience. Everyone, regardless of status or wealth, had to participate. The richest merchant and the poorest fisherman both had to restrain themselves. Equality in enforced civility. It was one of the few times when social hierarchy didn't matter. Everyone was equally obligated to behave. There was something beautiful about it, honestly. The recognition that humans need external structure sometimes, that we can't always rely on goodwill and best intentions, that sometimes peace requires enforcement, and that's okay. Christmas peace said, "We know you're angry, we know you're stressed, we know you have legitimate grievances. But for 12 days we're putting all of that aside because we need to survive together. We need this break from conflict. We need to remember what community feels like without violence and anger poisoning everything." And it worked. For 12 days, peace reigned. Forced, legally mandated, sometimes resentful peace, but peace nonetheless. And honestly, in a world of polar darkness, crushing cold, and barely surviving, peace, however it came, was a gift. Even if it came with the threat of execution. Merry Christmas. Now behave. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed with electric lights just to switch away, take a moment to think about those Arctic families. The ones who celebrated Christmas when Christmas meant something different. Something harder. Something that required more courage than we'll probably ever need. They didn't have central heating or grocery stores or therapy apps. They had each other, flickering candles, and a stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. They created beauty in the bleakest circumstances. They found joy in dried fish and wooden toys. They built traditions around survival and called it celebration. Every Christmas carol sung in the freezing dark was an act of defiance. Every Yule log kept burning was a small victory. Every neighbour visited through the frozen night was proof that humans need each other more than we need comfort. They understood something we've maybe forgotten, that the meaning of a celebration isn't in its abundance but in its intention, in the effort, in the showing up, even when showing up means risking frostbite just to sit in a cold church and sing. These people weren't special, they were just human. Regular people dealing with extraordinary circumstances, doing what humans have always done, adapting, enduring, creating light where there was none. They were your ancestors, metaphorically if not literally. They're the reason you can complain about your holiday stress while standing in a heated home, scrolling on a device that would have seemed like pure magic to them. The trolls they feared were real in their own way. Not literal monsters, but the very real dangers of isolation, despair, and giving up. And they fought those trolls with fire, community, aquavit, and an unshakable belief that the sun would return. That spring would come. That survival was possible if you just held on a little longer. So maybe whisper a quiet thank you to those stubborn souls who celebrated Christmas in total darkness, who knitted by firelight, who left porridge for hidden people, who built bonfires to scare away their fears, who survived on hope when hope was all they had. Because they did survive. They thrived even. They created a culture so rich and resilient that we're still talking about it, still learning from it, still in awe of it. And their message to us, across the centuries, is simple. You're stronger than you think. Humans always are. We survive the darkness. We create our own light. And we do it together, even when together means being annoyed at the same 7 people for 12 days straight. The sun always comes back. Always. Sometimes you just have to wait in the dark and trust the promise. Sleep well tonight. The sun will rise tomorrow. You have electricity and indoor plumbing and socks without holes. You've never had to eat lutefisk unless you actively chose to, which means you're winning at life. And somewhere in the distant north, the descendants of those Arctic survivors are still there, still celebrating Christmas, still proving that humans can make a home anywhere, no matter how dark it gets. Rest easy. The trolls aren't real. The hidden people are satisfied with their porridge. The Yule Cat has been appeased, and you, warm and safe and drifting off to sleep, are the heir to a legacy of resilience you never earned but absolutely inherited. Good night. The darkness never wins. Not then. Not now. Not ever.